Before the emergence of emperors, dynasties, or written law, the foundations of Chinese civilization were shaped by geography. The political systems that later defined imperial China developed within a specific environmental setting, one that both enabled agricultural abundance and imposed persistent structural challenges. Understanding the rise of early Chinese states requires first examining the landscape in which they formed. The North China Plain stretches from the foothills of the Taihang Mountains in the west to the Bohai Sea in the east. It is one of East Asia's largest continuous lowland regions, formed primarily through millennia of sediment deposits from the Yellow River and its tributaries. This river, known historically as the Huanghe, carried enormous quantities of loess, fine, wind-blown silt originating from the Loess Plateau to the northwest. Over time, these deposits created deep, fertile soils ideal for dry field agriculture. Archaeological evidence indicates that by the Neolithic period, communities across the Yellow River Basin had begun cultivating millet as a staple crop. Sites associated with the Yangshao culture, dating to approximately 5000 to 3000 BCE, show permanent settlements, storage pits, and ceramic production. These developments allowed population density to increase, anchoring societies to specific territories rather than seasonal mobility. Agricultural reliability encouraged the emergence of surplus production, which became a precondition for social differentiation and centralized authority. However, the same environmental processes that enriched the soil also introduced instability. The Yellow River's heavy sediment load caused its riverbed to rise above surrounding plains, making flooding frequent and unpredictable. Historical records and geological studies confirm repeated course changes over millennia. Managing floodwaters required coordinated labor, long-term planning, and hierarchical oversight. As a result, early political authority in northern China developed in close association with hydraulic control. The Loess Plateau itself further shaped early state formation. Its easily worked soils supported early agriculture, but they were also highly susceptible to erosion. Deforestation and intensive farming increased runoff, accelerating sediment deposition downstream. These conditions created feedback loops in which environmental management became inseparable from governance. Authority was increasingly tied to the ability to mobilize labor for infrastructure projects, such as embankments and canals. By the early Bronze Age, these processes were visible in more complex political formations. The Erlita culture, dated approximately to 1900 to 1500 BCE and located near the Middle Yellow River, provides some of the earliest archaeological evidence of state-level society in China. Excavations reveal palatial foundations, road networks, bronze ritual vessels, and evidence of craft specialization. While its precise political identity remains debated, many scholars associate Erlitou with the Xia dynasty described in later texts. What distinguishes Erlitou from earlier settlements is scale and coordination. Urban planning suggests centralized decision-making, while bronze production required controlled access to copper, tin, and skilled labor. These features indicate an early hierarchy in which elites exercised authority over resources, labor, and ritual practice. The physical organization of space reflects an emerging political order shaped by environmental constraints and opportunities. This pattern intensified during the Shang Dynasty, particularly at Erligang period sites dating to the 16th to 13th centuries BCE. Archaeological centers such as Zhengzhou and later Anyang display massive rammed earth walls, palatial complexes, and industrial zones for bronze casting. Oracle bone inscriptions from late Shang contexts provide direct textual evidence of kingship, divination, warfare, and tribute extraction. These records indicate a political system in which rulers mediated between the natural and supernatural worlds, reinforcing authority through ritual and military power. The Shang state relied heavily on agricultural surplus extracted from surrounding territories. Control over river valleys and arable land supported both elite consumption and large-scale bronze production. At the same time, dependence on agriculture tied political stability to environmental conditions. Droughts, floods, or soil exhaustion could undermine the economic base of authority, making environmental management a central concern of governance. Across these early periods, political hierarchy did not emerge independently of geography. Instead, it developed through sustained interaction with a demanding landscape. The need to organize labor, regulate water, and defend productive land encouraged the formation of centralized leadership and administrative practices. These early institutions were not yet imperial in form, but they established enduring patterns of territorial control and bureaucratic coordination. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, northern China had already developed core features that would define later dynastic rule: sedentary agriculture, surplus extraction, hierarchical authority, and state involvement in environmental management. Although dynasties rose and fell, the underlying relationship between land, labor, and power remained consistent. These geographic and environmental foundations did not determine history in isolation, but they structured the possibilities available to early rulers. As political organization evolved beyond Bronze Age kingdoms, these same landscapes continued to shape the strategies and institutions of centralized rule. With these foundations in place, early dynastic systems could experiment with more formalized political authority and territorial administration. Before continuing, viewers who wish to follow future episodes in this series may subscribe to the channel and enable notifications for regular Nightfall history releases. Engagement through comments also helps guide future topics and discussions. The political structures that preceded the Han Dynasty were shaped by a long process of institutional experimentation, fragmentation, and reform. This process began under the Western Zhou dynasty and culminated in the highly centralized states of the Warring States period. Rather than a sudden collapse, the transformation unfolded gradually over several centuries, driven by changes in military technology, economic organization, and political ideology. The Western Zhou dynasty, established around 1046 BCE after the overthrow of the Shang, governed through a feudal system based on hereditary land grants. The Zhou kings distributed territories to relatives and loyal allies, who ruled as regional lords while owing ritual allegiance and military support to the royal house. Authority was justified through the concept later known as the Mandate of Heaven, which framed political legitimacy as conditional upon moral governance and cosmic approval. Bronze inscriptions from this period record royal grants, rituals, and lineages, demonstrating the close connection between kinship, ritual practice, and political power. For several centuries, this system provided relative stability. However, it depended on personal loyalty and ritual cohesion rather than direct administrative control. As generations passed, regional lords accumulated independent power, and the Zhou king's ability to enforce authority diminished. The relocation of the Zhou capital eastward in 771 BCE, following invasions and internal conflict, marked the effective end of centralized royal power and the beginning of the Eastern Zhou period. During the spring and autumn period, c. 771 to 476 BCE, dozens of states competed for influence while still nominally recognizing the Zhou king. Political authority increasingly rested with powerful regional rulers rather than the royal court. Contemporary texts such as the Zhuozhuan describe shifting alliances, interstate warfare, and diplomatic conventions that attempted to regulate conflict. Warfare during this period was still dominated by aristocratic chariots and elite combat, reflecting older social hierarchies. Over time, these conventions eroded. The introduction of iron tools improved agricultural productivity, expanding the tax base available to rulers. At the same time, military technology evolved. Crossbows, iron weapons, and large infantry formations reduced the dominance of hereditary warrior elites. States that could mobilize and supply mass armies gained strategic advantages. As a result, political power shifted toward rulers capable of organizing populations, standardizing command, and maintaining permanent bureaucracies. By the Warring States period, 475 to 221 BCE, competition had intensified into sustained, large-scale conflict among a smaller number of powerful states, including Qin, Chu, Qi, Wei, Han, Yan, and Zhao. Warfare became existential. States that failed to reform were conquered or absorbed. Administrative centralization replaced feudal delegation, as rulers appointed officials directly and governed through defined territorial units. One of the most influential reform programs was implemented in the state of Qin during the 4th century BCE under Xiongnu. According to later historical accounts preserved in the Shiji, these reforms abolished hereditary privileges, introduced uniform laws, and reorganized society into households registered directly with the state. Land was privatized and taxed, military rank was awarded based on merit rather than lineage, and collective responsibility was enforced through strict legal codes. These measures strengthened state control over resources and manpower. Similar reforms, though differing in form, occurred across other states. Legal statutes were codified, census registration expanded, and agricultural production was prioritized over commerce and ritual expenditure. Excavated legal texts from sites such as Shuihudi provide material evidence of standardized laws and administrative procedures. The state increasingly penetrated everyday life, regulating labor, taxation, and military service. This era of instability also produced intense intellectual activity. Thinkers sought explanations for disorder and proposed solutions for restoring stability. Confucius emphasized moral cultivation, ritual propriety, and hierarchical harmony. Taoist texts questioned coercive rule and advocated alignment with natural order. Legalist thinkers argued that predictable laws and strict enforcement were the only reliable foundations of state power. These schools did not exist in isolation but competed for patronage among rulers seeking effective governance strategies. By the late Warring States period, ideological debate had become inseparable from political practice. Rulers selectively adopted doctrines that supported centralization and military strength. While moral rhetoric remained important, institutional effectiveness increasingly determined survival. The political landscape favored states that combined administrative discipline with economic productivity and military capacity. By the 3rd century BCE, the old Zhou feudal order had fully dissolved. In its place stood centralized territorial states governed by law, bureaucracy, and standing armies. The transition reshaped political authority, social structure, and ideology across northern China. Out of this prolonged conflict and reform emerged the conditions necessary for unification, achieved by the Qin state at the end of the Warring States period. By the late 3rd century BCE, centuries of political fragmentation and reform culminated in the emergence of the Qin state as the dominant power in northern China. Unlike its rivals, Qin had fully institutionalized the administrative and military innovations developed during the Warring States period. Under the leadership of King Zheng, later known as Qin Shi Huang, these systems were deployed on an unprecedented scale, resulting in the first unification of China in 221 BCE. Qin's unification was achieved through sustained military campaigns against the remaining rival states between 230 and 221 BCE. These campaigns relied on mass conscription, standardized weaponry, and disciplined command structures. Archaeological finds, including bronze swords and crossbow mechanisms recovered from Qin sites, demonstrate high levels of standardization and state-controlled production. Military success was inseparable from administrative capacity, as logistics, taxation, and manpower mobilization were centrally coordinated. Following unification, Qin Shi Huang abolished the remnants of feudal governance. Hereditary fiefs were eliminated, and the empire was reorganized into commanderies and counties governed by appointed officials rather than aristocrats. This administrative restructuring severed local power bases and ensured that authority flowed directly from the imperial center. Records preserved in later historical texts indicate that officials were rotated regularly, preventing the consolidation of regional loyalties. Standardization became a defining feature of Qin rule. The state imposed a unified written script, replacing regional variants with a standardized form that facilitated administration across vast territories. Weights, measures, and coinage were likewise standardized, enabling consistent taxation and commercial exchange. Road systems radiating from the capital connected commanderies and allowed for rapid troop movement and information transfer. These measures transformed a collection of former states into an integrated imperial system. Legalist governance underpinned these reforms. Qin law emphasized clarity, uniformity, and strict enforcement. Collective responsibility was enforced at the household level, with severe punishments imposed for failure to report crimes. Legal texts excavated from Qin-era sites reflect a system designed to regulate behavior comprehensively, minimizing reliance on personal judgment or moral discretion. Authority was embedded in institutions rather than individuals, reinforcing centralized control. Large-scale state projects further illustrate the reach of Qin administration. The construction of defensive walls along the northern frontier, later incorporated into the Great Wall, aimed to secure borders against steppe incursions. Massive labor forces were mobilized for these projects, including conscripted peasants and convicts. Canal construction and road building similarly depended on coerced labor, reflecting the state's ability to extract resources directly from the population. Imperial ideology was expressed materially through monumental architecture and funerary practices. The mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang near modern Xi'an, guarded by the Terracotta Army, provides archaeological evidence of centralized organization and ideological messaging. Thousands of life-sized figures, arranged in military formation, demonstrate standardized production techniques and convey the emperor's claim to eternal authority. The scale of the project indicates both administrative capacity and the concentration of resources under imperial command. Despite its structural achievements, the Qin state proved fragile. Heavy taxation, prolonged military service, and compulsory labor placed extreme burdens on the population. Contemporary accounts preserved in later histories describe widespread resentment and unrest. The death of Qin Shi Huang in 210 BCE triggered a succession crisis that exposed weaknesses in the regime's reliance on coercion rather than consensus. Within a few years, rebellions erupted across the empire. Former soldiers, peasants, and local leaders mobilized against Qin authority. The centralized system that had enabled rapid conquest proved less effective at managing political legitimacy and social stability. By 206 BCE, the Qin dynasty had collapsed, bringing imperial rule to an abrupt end after only 15 years. Although short-lived, the Qin dynasty fundamentally altered the political landscape of China. It demonstrated that large-scale territorial unification was administratively possible and provided a concrete model of centralized governance. The commandery system, standardized law, and bureaucratic administration established under Qin rule did not disappear with the dynasty's fall. The collapse of Qin authority opened a period of renewed conflict, but it did not erase the imperial framework that Qin had created. Instead, subsequent rulers inherited its institutions and confronted the challenge of adapting them to achieve durability rather than domination. In 206 BCE, the Qin dynasty collapsed under the weight of internal rebellion, labor unrest, and administrative overextension. The sudden power vacuum left China fragmented, with former Qin territories contested by rival factions. Among these, two figures emerged as principal contenders: Liu Bang, a former minor official from Pei County, and Xiongnu, the aristocratic warlord of the Chu region. Their struggle, later termed the Chu-Han contention, determined the political trajectory of China for decades to come. Liu Bang's rise was atypical in the context of early imperial politics. Unlike Xiongnu, whose claim relied on lineage and martial prestige, Liu Bang's authority derived from pragmatic governance, personal charisma, and his ability to build coalitions. Archaeological surveys of Pei County and surrounding regions indicate a densely populated agrarian landscape, providing a substantial recruitment base for militias and levies. Liu Bang leveraged local support, cultivating loyalty among peasants, lower-ranking Qin administrators, and regional elites disaffected by Xiongnu's aristocratic approach. Military strategy during the Chu-Han contention combined conventional sieges with flexible logistics. Liu Bang's forces adapted to terrain, supply limitations, and enemy maneuvers, emphasizing mobility and intelligence. Records from the Shiji and Hanshu describe campaigns along the Huai and Yangtze rivers, highlighting the strategic importance of river transport and fortified positions. Control of key cities such as Pengcheng and Heniai allowed Liu Bang to secure supply lines while limiting Xiongnu's operational freedom. Coalition building played a critical role in Liu Bang's success. Former Qin officials, familiar with bureaucratic administration and taxation, were integrated into his command structure, providing organizational stability in newly conquered regions. Simultaneously, alliances with regional leaders neutralized potential threats and expanded manpower. These political arrangements enabled Liu Bang to consolidate gains without relying solely on coercive force. The decisive phase of the conflict occurred between 204 and 202 BCE. The Battle of Gaixia, fought in 202 BCE in modern Hubei, proved pivotal. Xiongnu's forces, outnumbered and encircled, faced logistical shortages and declining morale. According to historical accounts, psychological tactics, including feigned defections and appeals to loyalty, further weakened enemy cohesion. Xiongnu ultimately committed suicide, leaving Liu Bang as the uncontested ruler of a reunified Chinese territory. The significance of Liu Bang's victory extended beyond military conquest. By combining practical administration, moderate taxation, and strategic clemency, he established a model of legitimacy distinct from the coercive practices of the Qin. Early decrees documented in the Han Shu indicate that Liu Bang sought to stabilize the realm through law reform, redistribution of confiscated lands, and recognition of regional gentry. These policies encouraged population resettlement, infrastructure repair, and economic recovery after decades of warfare. Liu Bang's approach also incorporated ideological accommodation. While legalist administrative practices persisted, Confucian principles emphasizing ritual, hierarchy, and moral conduct were gradually reintroduced. Official appointments considered both talent and loyalty, reflecting a blend of meritocratic and pragmatic selection. These measures fostered long-term stability and institutional continuity, laying the groundwork for the central bureaucracy characteristic of the Han Dynasty. Throughout the Chu-Han contention, the interplay of military competence and political acumen was evident. Liu Bang's ability to integrate disparate groups into a functional governance system demonstrates the importance of adaptive leadership. Archaeological evidence, including urban layouts and fortifications in captured cities, confirms the rapid transition from military occupation to structured administration, reinforcing the textual record. By the conclusion of the conflict in 202 BCE, Liu Bang had transformed a period of civil war into the foundation for a lasting dynasty. The consolidation of authority combined centralized control with local cooperation, establishing precedents for taxation, law, and bureaucracy that would persist for centuries. The military campaigns, while decisive, were inseparable from broader strategies of governance, demonstrating that success in early imperial China required both conquest and administration. With the battlefield secured, the next imperative for Liu Bang was the systematic consolidation of authority across the reunified empire. Policies aimed at standardizing administration, stabilizing the economy, and integrating diverse populations became essential for transforming temporary victory into durable imperial governance. Following the conclusion of the Chu-Han contention, Liu Bang faced the challenge of consolidating a fragmented empire. Unlike the Qin dynasty, which relied on strict centralization and coercive authority, the early Han had to integrate territories that had endured decades of warfare, famine, and population displacement. The resulting governance strategy relied on compromise, combining elements of Qin institutional frameworks with a revival of feudal principles to ensure stability. One of the central mechanisms of this compromise was the creation of semi-autonomous kingdoms. Liu Bang granted titles and territories to close relatives, loyal generals, and former allies, while retaining direct imperial control over strategically vital commanderies. Textual sources such as the Han Shu document the assignment of fiefs to his brothers and former generals, providing them with limited fiscal autonomy and local administrative authority. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions and tomb architecture, indicates these kingdoms exercise their own local governance but remain subordinate to the emperor in matters of taxation and military service. Simultaneously, the central administration preserved many Qin-era structures, including the commandery county system, standardized weights and measures, and a professional bureaucracy. Officials appointed directly by the imperial court oversaw legal adjudication, revenue collection, and public works in key regions. This dual system allowed Liu Bang to assert authority over the empire's core while accommodating local elites who might otherwise resist direct control. The early Han also modified Qin legal practices. Severe punishments, collective responsibility, and extensive labor levies were reduced in favor of moderated laws that allowed for flexibility in local enforcement. Historical texts describe the reduction of corvée obligations and tax relief for peasants, measures intended to encourage resettlement and agricultural productivity. By tempering coercion with practical governance, the Han mitigated the social unrest that had contributed to the Qin collapse. Confucian scholars began to re-enter government during this period, advising on ethical administration, ritual propriety, and personnel management. While legalist administrators remained essential for bureaucratic efficiency, Confucian guidance helped legitimize the new regime and foster loyalty among the literate elite. Court records indicate that officials were increasingly evaluated for moral conduct as well as competence, foreshadowing the eventual integration of Confucian ideology into statecraft. Economic reconstruction was a parallel priority. The early Han sought to repair infrastructure, restore irrigation works, and re-establish granaries disrupted by war. Archaeological surveys along the Yellow River Basin reveal early restoration of levees and canals, suggesting a coordinated effort to stabilize agricultural production. Surplus harvests enabled the state to fund military garrisons, support regional kingdoms, and maintain imperial authority without overburdening the populace. The hybrid system achieved short-term stability by distributing authority in a manner that accounted for both political necessity and regional realities. Kingdoms provided localized governance capable of responding to immediate social and economic concerns, while the central bureaucracy ensured consistency in law, taxation, and military organization. The early Han state, therefore, balanced flexibility with hierarchy, creating an adaptable structure suitable for post-war reconstruction. Despite these advantages, latent tensions emerged between central and regional authorities. Semi-autonomous kingdoms could resist or manipulate imperial directives, and differences in administration and legal enforcement occasionally generated conflict. Historical accounts from later periods record disputes over succession, taxation, and military levies that foreshadowed the challenges the dynasty would face during periods of weak central leadership. The compromises also required careful ideological framing. By presenting concessions as part of the moral and legal order, the imperial court sought to prevent perceptions of weakness. Administrative edicts emphasized the legitimacy of the emperor's authority while recognizing the practical contributions of local rulers. Textual evidence from the early Han Code of Laws illustrates how governance blended coercion, regulation, and ritual recognition. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, this system of compromise had allowed the Han Dynasty to recover from civil war, stabilize population centers, and consolidate political authority. It established patterns of dual administration, moderated legal enforcement, and ideological negotiation that would characterize early imperial governance. Yet, the balance achieved in this period also created conditions for future conflicts between the center and periphery, illustrating the enduring tension between localized autonomy and centralized authority. These early political arrangements provided a framework for expansion and institutional development. However, as population growth, economic integration, and military campaigns intensified, the constraints of compromise began to test the durability of imperial control. The following decades would reveal both the strengths and vulnerabilities inherent in the Han model of governance. By the mid-2nd century BCE, the Han Dynasty faced a critical test of its semi-feudal political structure. The early compromise that had balanced central authority with semi-autonomous kingdoms proved increasingly unstable. Regional princes retained substantial military and fiscal autonomy, undermining the ability of the imperial court to enforce uniform policy. This tension came to a head during the reign of Emperor Jing, who sought to curtail the power of the most independent kingdoms. The immediate catalyst was the reduction of feudal privileges. The imperial court, concerned that powerful princes could challenge central authority, began reclaiming territories and reducing their fiscal resources. According to the Han Shu, these measures targeted kingdoms such as Wu, Chu, Zhao, Jiaoxi, and Liang, which maintained extensive armed forces and exercised de facto sovereignty within their territories. The initiative reflected a calculated attempt to enforce hierarchical control over the empire without provoking widespread unrest. In 154 BCE, resistance coalesced into what historians have termed the Rebellion of the Seven States. 7 semi-autonomous kingdoms revolted simultaneously, mobilizing military forces to challenge imperial authority. Archaeological surveys of contemporaneous fortifications and weapon caches indicate that regional armies were substantial, well-trained, and capable of sustained campaigns. The uprising was a direct response to reductions in territorial and fiscal autonomy, illustrating the structural fragility of early Han compromise. Emperor Jing's response combined military efficiency, strategic coordination, and political calculation. The central government deployed imperial armies led by trusted generals, while simultaneously exploiting rivalries among the rebel kingdoms. Commanderies loyal to the throne provided intelligence, logistical support, and reinforcements. Historical records describe coordinated multi-front campaigns, siege operations, and systematic disruption of enemy supply lines. Within months, imperial forces had decisively defeated the insurgents. The consequences of the rebellion were significant. Most of the major semi-autonomous kingdoms lost substantial territory and authority, while smaller principalities were directly annexed into the central commandery system. The reorganization reduced the military and fiscal capacity of hereditary princes, effectively subordinating them to imperial oversight. Textual sources document the reassignment of commanderies to officials appointed by the court and the standardization of administrative procedures, including tax collection, legal adjudication, and conscription. Beyond territorial control, the suppression reinforced the emperor's symbolic authority. Imperial decrees emphasized that loyalty to the throne was the legitimate basis for political power, while insubordination was punishable by confiscation of land and titles. Bronze inscriptions and official seals from the period illustrate the extension of central bureaucratic oversight into formerly independent regions. These measures strengthened the coherence of imperial governance, enabling the Han to enforce policies consistently across vast and diverse territories. The rebellion also had long-term structural implications. By demonstrating the risks inherent in semi-feudal arrangements, the crisis provided a rationale for expanding the commandery system and limiting the autonomy of hereditary elites. Legal frameworks were adjusted to consolidate authority, and succession rules for princes were clarified to prevent the accumulation of excessive power. The resulting centralization laid the institutional foundation for a durable bureaucratic empire. Economic control followed military consolidation. The annexed territories were integrated into imperial tax and labor systems, ensuring a stable flow of revenue to the court. Standardized weights, measures, and coinage facilitated trade and resource allocation, while administrative oversight allowed for the regulation of agriculture, public works, and defense infrastructure. Archaeological evidence from restored granaries and canal systems indicates that the Han used these resources to support both military garrisons and urban centers, reinforcing the practical benefits of centralization. The suppression of the feudal kings also influenced ideological development. By framing central authority as the source of legitimacy and law, the Han court strengthened its ideological claim to unchallengeable rule. Confucian scholars in the court supported this narrative, linking filial loyalty and social hierarchy to obedience to the emperor. Legalist principles continued to inform administrative efficiency, but the fusion of ideology and governance reinforced both compliance and moral justification for centralization. By the conclusion of these events, the Han Dynasty had definitively transitioned from a hybrid semi-feudal state to a centralized imperial bureaucracy. Military authority, fiscal control, and administrative oversight were concentrated in the emperor's hands, while hereditary princes were rendered subordinate and largely ceremonial. This structural transformation ensured that subsequent emperors could enforce uniform policies, maintain territorial cohesion, and mobilize resources for expansion, taxation, and defense. With internal control secured, the Han court was positioned to consolidate ideological authority and define the identity of the state. The administrative, legal, and fiscal frameworks established through the suppression of the seven states provided the foundation upon which the dynasty would formalize laws, institutionalize Confucian principles, and govern an integrated Chinese empire for centuries. Following the centralization of imperial authority under the early Han, rulers faced the challenge of legitimizing governance across a vast and diverse population. While legalist administrative methods had facilitated control, the dynasty sought a complementary ideological framework capable of reinforcing moral authority, social order, and dynastic legitimacy. Confucianism, with its emphasis on hierarchy, ritual, and moral cultivation, emerged as the principal tool for this purpose. The revival of Confucian thought was gradual, building on centuries of intellectual discourse. Early Han emperors preserved legalist institutions for bureaucracy, taxation, and law but endorsed Confucian advisors to guide policy and moral instruction. Among the most influential was Dong Zhongshu, c. 179 to 104 BCE, whose writings synthesized ethical philosophy with cosmological theory. Dong proposed that the emperor's mandate was inseparable from moral virtue, linking governance to the natural order and to heaven itself. According to historical texts, this conceptual framework justified imperial intervention, discouraged corruption, and framed rebellion as both a political and cosmic violation. Standardization of classical texts became a key component of this revival. The early Han court commissioned the collation, editing, and preservation of Confucian works, ensuring that ritual, history, and ethical instruction were transmitted consistently. Texts such as the Book of Documents, Spring and Autumn Annals, and the Analects were systematically copied and annotated for use in governance and education. Archaeological discoveries, including manuscripts at Guodian, Hubei, and Mawangdui, Hunan, reveal the diversity of early Han thought, demonstrating both textual variation and engagement with alternative schools, such as Taoist and legalist writings. These finds illustrate the intellectual context in which Confucianism was canonized. Confucian revival did not displace legalist principles. The Han retained centralized bureaucracy, codified law, and administrative oversight, reflecting the enduring utility of legalist methods. Instead, Confucianism reframed governance within a moral and ritualistic discourse. Laws were interpreted not only as mechanisms of control but as instruments aligned with virtue and cosmic order. Official communication, ceremonies, and policy implementation increasingly reflected this ethical orientation, creating a synthesis of practicality and moral justification. Scholars played a central role in operationalizing Confucian thought. They advised the court, trained bureaucrats, and evaluated local officials. Court records from the Hanshu describe examinations, lectures, and appointments based on knowledge of classical texts. This integration of scholarship into administration ensured that ethical reasoning guided both policy and personnel selection, even while day-to-day enforcement relied on legalist precision. Archaeological evidence underscores the material transmission of Confucian knowledge. Bamboo strips and silk manuscripts from Mawangdui, dating to the early 2nd century BCE, preserve commentaries on ritual, cosmology, and ethical conduct. These texts reflect both continuity with Zhou-era practices and the innovative synthesis characteristic of early Han intellectual life. Guodian manuscripts further illustrate experimentation with text compilation and moral interpretation, demonstrating that canon formation was a dynamic process rather than a uniform imposition. The moralization of governance extended to public ritual and ceremonial practice. Emperors performed sacrifices, observed seasonal rites, and presided over ritual calendars, reinforcing the ethical dimension of authority. Historical records link these practices to both political legitimacy and social cohesion, suggesting that Confucian principles were actively embedded in statecraft, not merely theoretical instruction. This alignment of ritual, law, and ethics reinforced hierarchical order and provided a symbolic framework that legitimized the emperor's role as the moral arbiter of the empire. Confucian revival also shaped education and elite formation. Local academies and imperial schools trained future officials, embedding classical learning within the bureaucratic structure. Knowledge of Confucian texts became a prerequisite for office, ensuring that moral reasoning informed policy decisions. By institutionalizing scholarship, the Han Dynasty created a durable system in which ideology and administration were mutually reinforcing. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, Confucianism had achieved both intellectual prominence and practical application. While legalist administration remained essential for efficiency, Confucian principles guided moral conduct, ethical evaluation of officials, and public ritual. This dual system established the foundation for the Han state's enduring ideological framework, combining law, morality, and institutional governance. With Confucian texts standardized and scholars embedded within government, the next phase of state building involved the creation of an educational infrastructure capable of sustaining bureaucratic competence. The moral and intellectual foundations laid during this period would directly influence examination practices, administrative training, and the ideological coherence of the Han state for centuries. By the early 2nd century BCE, The Han Dynasty had established a firm ideological foundation rooted in Confucian principles. To operationalize this moral framework and ensure administrative cohesion across a vast empire, Emperor Wu formally established the Imperial Academy in 124 BCE. Known as the Taixue, the academy served as both a center of scholarship and a pipeline for bureaucratic recruitment. It institutionalized the link between classical knowledge, moral reputation, and official authority. The Imperial Academy was located near the capital, Chang'an, and functioned as the preeminent educational institution of the dynasty. Students, drawn from the elite and gentry, were instructed in the Confucian classics, history, ritual practice, and ethical governance. While early Han bureaucratic appointments did not rely on competitive examinations, selection emphasized proficiency in these texts and demonstrated moral conduct. Records from the Han Shu indicate that scholars recommended by the academy were often appointed to administrative positions within commanderies and central ministries. Education at the Imperial Academy served multiple functions. Primarily, it standardized the intellectual and ethical framework of government officials, ensuring that imperial policies were interpreted and implemented consistently. Inscriptions and recovered bamboo texts reveal curriculum focused on the 5 classics, the spring and autumn annals, and ritual commentaries, providing officials with a shared reference for legal interpretation, ceremonial practice, and ethical decision-making. This coherence reinforced both administrative uniformity and ideological legitimacy across the empire. The academy also functioned as a mechanism of social integration. By training students from diverse regions and family backgrounds in a centralized curriculum, the Han Dynasty created a literate and ethically oriented elite capable of governing territories far from the capital. Archaeological evidence from tomb inscriptions shows that officials educated in the academy often served in multiple provinces, transferring knowledge, standards, and ritual practice across administrative units. This mobility helped integrate distant commanderies into a coherent imperial system. Recruitment from the academy reflected both merit and recommendation. Officials were evaluated on their understanding of classical texts, adherence to Confucian ethics, and personal reputation within their communities. While familial connections remained influential, the academy provided a formalized avenue through which scholarly aptitude could translate into administrative authority. Contemporary accounts describe the nomination of students by local magistrates and their subsequent service in commanderies, illustrating the practical link between education and governance. The integration of Confucian scholarship into bureaucratic recruitment had practical implications for state administration. Officials trained in the academy were expected to mediate between imperial directives and local conditions, applying moral reasoning to legal and economic decisions. Their training emphasized the responsibilities of office, including fiscal management, regulation of public works, and adjudication of disputes. Excavated administrative documents from Han commanderies provide evidence of standardized reporting formats, tax registers, and correspondence, reflecting the diffusion of academy-trained administrative norms. In addition to technical proficiency, the academy promoted a shared elite culture. Ritual observance, moral instruction, and historical precedent became central to official identity. Officials were encouraged to model Confucian virtues in both private and public life, aligning personal conduct with imperial expectations. This cultural cohesion reinforced social hierarchies and legitimized the authority of the emperor, who was both political leader and moral exemplar. The establishment of the Imperial Academy also had long-term institutional consequences. By linking scholarship with official service, the Han Dynasty created a precedent for bureaucratic professionalization. Administrative knowledge became codified and transmissible, reducing reliance on personal loyalty alone. Over subsequent centuries, this framework evolved into more formalized civil service mechanisms, including examinations, but its early foundation rested on the academy's integration of moral education and governance. Through the academy, learning became a pathway to power and social influence. It enabled the Han state to cultivate a cadre of officials capable of administering an expansive empire, enforcing law, and maintaining social order. By embedding moral and intellectual standards within governance, the dynasty ensured that policy decisions were not purely coercive, but informed by shared ethical and historical reference points. By the end of the 1st century BCE, the Imperial Academy had firmly established the principle that administrative competence and ethical cultivation were inseparable. An educated bureaucracy allowed the Han Dynasty to manage internal diversity, coordinate economic and military activity, and implement imperial directives consistently. With this institutional infrastructure in place, the dynasty was positioned to pursue broader territorial and political ambitions, laying the foundation for Han dominance across East Asia. The consolidation of Han authority depended not only on administrative efficiency and Confucian scholarship but also on the symbolic and cosmological validation of imperial power. In the early Han period, the emperor was conceived as the mediator between heaven, Tian, and earth, responsible for maintaining cosmic order through ritual observance and symbolic governance. Political legitimacy was therefore inseparable from both moral conduct and ceremonial performance. State rituals constituted the principal means by which the emperor enacted this mediating role. Central to this practice were sacrifices at key sacred sites, most prominently Mount Tai in the east and the imperial ancestral temples near Chang'an. The Hanshu records elaborate on seasonal ceremonies designed to align human activity with the rhythms of heaven. These rites reinforced the emperor's role as moral and cosmological arbiter, signaling that decisions in governance were consistent with universal order rather than merely personal preference or coercive authority. Astronomical observation and omen interpretation were integral to imperial decision-making. Astronomers and court astrologers monitored celestial phenomena such as comets, eclipses, and planetary alignments, which were recorded in early Han annals. These events were interpreted as indicators of political favor or warning signs of maladministration. For example, the appearance of unusual stars or solar eclipses prompted ritual response, policy review, or the dispatch of envoys to address local disturbances. Excavated oracle bones and early astronomical charts confirm the practical recording and monitoring of such phenomena, demonstrating the empirical basis for ideological practice. Ritual and cosmology also reinforced social hierarchy. By performing sacrifices on behalf of the state, the emperor publicly embodied the moral authority expected of the ruling house. These ceremonies emphasized the interdependence of ruler, officials, and populace. Officials coordinated the logistics of ritual, while the population was symbolically incorporated into the cosmological order through participation in agricultural and civic cycles. Inscriptions on bronze vessels and temple stelae document the scale and frequency of these events, illustrating both organizational complexity and ideological significance. The ideological framework extended into policy and law. Decisions regarding taxation, labor conscription, and resource allocation were justified within the moral cosmic context of the emperor's duties. Legal codes referenced ritual propriety, while administrative edicts often invoked the welfare of the people as part of maintaining harmony with heaven. Historical records indicate that the emperor's moral and ceremonial conduct was considered a predictor of political stability. Natural disasters or famines were interpreted as indicators of deficient governance, prompting both corrective measures and ritual observance. Confucian scholars contributed to this integration of ideology and administration. Dong Zhongshu and his intellectual successors emphasized the moral obligations of the ruler and the correspondence between ethical governance and cosmic favor. Textual compilations, preserved in the Han Shu, describe how virtuous conduct and ritual precision were expected to prevent unrest and ensure harmonious relations between central authority and regional administration. Education in the Imperial Academy further reinforced this understanding, embedding cosmological awareness within the bureaucracy. Ritual, cosmology, and imperial legitimacy were also mobilized to consolidate authority across the empire's expanding territories. Local magistrates coordinated provincial sacrifices in accordance with central directives, while standardized ceremonial protocols ensured ideological uniformity. Archaeological evidence, including reconstructed altars, temple foundations, and sacrificial pits, demonstrates the wide geographic dissemination of these practices. By embedding symbolic governance in local administration, the Han Dynasty aligned practical authority with cosmological validation, reinforcing obedience and social cohesion. The performance of ritual also served as a mechanism for surveillance and communication. Festivals, sacrifices, and seasonal observances were accompanied by inspection tours and reports, allowing central officials to monitor provincial compliance and population well-being. Historical texts describe how ritual calendars were closely tied to agricultural cycles, state granaries, and conscription schedules. This integration of ideology, administration, and economy strengthened both central authority and the functional efficiency of governance. By linking moral conduct, ritual observance, and celestial interpretation, the Han Emperor established a durable framework of legitimacy. Rule was justified not only through law or military power but by demonstrating alignment with the cosmic order. This ideological coherence reinforced both elite compliance and popular acceptance, providing a stable basis for the expansion of administration, taxation, and infrastructure. By the late 2nd century BCE, the fusion of ritual, cosmology, and administrative practice enabled the Han Dynasty to consolidate internal cohesion while projecting authority across vast territories. Ideological unity, underpinned by both Confucian scholarship and ritual observance, allowed the central government to coordinate economic production, mobilize labor, and implement policy uniformly. This integration of morality, symbolism, and bureaucracy created a foundation for the long-term stability and expansion of the Han imperial state. The Han dynasty's strength was rooted in its agrarian economy, which depended upon the productivity of millions of peasant households spread across the empire. Smallholding households served as the fundamental unit of economic organization, sustaining local communities, supplying state revenues, and forming the backbone of military conscription. Land tenure in this period reflected a synthesis of inherited Qin reforms and adaptations specific to Han governance. Private land ownership was widespread among peasant households, a system that emerged from Qin legal reforms which had redistributed land from feudal elites to individual cultivators. Households generally held plots sufficient for subsistence and surplus production, which were cultivated using iron tools, such as plows, harrows, and seed drills. Archaeological excavations in the North China Plain, particularly in Hunan and Shandong provinces, confirm the use of iron implements that increased efficiency and allowed for multiple cropping cycles, enhancing both output and state revenue. Taxes were assessed primarily through grain levies, corvée labor obligations, and a poll tax. The household register system, Hukou, facilitated empire-wide censuses, most notably in 2 CE, which enumerated population, land holdings, and productive capacity. These records allowed the imperial government to calculate precise levies, assign labor obligations for public works, and enforce military conscription. Grain levies were collected seasonally and stored in state granaries, which functioned both as strategic reserves and as instruments for market stabilization during periods of famine or crop failure. The household's fiscal obligations were intertwined with administrative oversight. Local magistrates monitored cultivation practices, crop yields, and compliance with tax collection. Written records, including wooden slips and bronze tally systems recovered from Han sites, document standardized reporting procedures, reflecting both administrative sophistication and the central government's direct engagement with agrarian production. These measures enabled the state to mobilize resources effectively, maintaining both food security and fiscal stability. Despite these institutional mechanisms, structural challenges emerged over time. Wealthier families and regional elites increasingly consolidated land holdings, often through inheritance, purchase, or accumulation of forfeited plots. This concentration of land created disparities in wealth and productivity, leaving many smallholders dependent on tenant farming or subject to rising rents. Textual sources, including edicts and memorials from the late Western Han period, describe peasant indebtedness and social tension arising from these inequalities. While the state intervened periodically through redistribution or relief measures, the accumulation of large estates remained a persistent source of vulnerability. The Han government employed several strategies to mitigate these challenges. State granaries purchased surplus grain from prosperous households, which could be redistributed during shortages to stabilize prices and prevent famine-induced unrest. Additionally, corvée labor was periodically adjusted to accommodate local production levels, reflecting an awareness of the limits of peasant capacity. Records of seasonal labor rotations and conscription suggest careful coordination between local agricultural calendars and state requirements, balancing extraction with sustainable production. Agricultural productivity was further enhanced by technological innovation. Iron plows with adjustable moldboards and seed drills allowed for deeper cultivation and more uniform sowing. Archaeological evidence indicates widespread use of irrigation works, canals, and small-scale levees, particularly in the Yellow River Basin, which increased arable land and mitigated flooding risks. These improvements strengthened both local subsistence and the capacity of the state to collect surplus for taxation, supporting urban centers, the military, and administrative infrastructure. The combination of smallholder cultivation, technological advancement, and bureaucratic oversight underpinned the Han fiscal system. Household-based taxation provided a predictable revenue stream for imperial projects, including road construction, city maintenance, and frontier defense. Grain levies and labor obligations ensured that the state could mobilize human and material resources without reliance on coercive aristocratic intermediaries, consolidating the authority of the emperor and the central bureaucracy. However, the tension between peasant autonomy and elite accumulation persisted as a structural vulnerability. Local elites could influence taxation, labor allocation, and land disputes, occasionally undermining state authority. Over time, these dynamics contributed to social pressure, prompting later reforms such as the equal field system in subsequent dynasties, which sought to regulate land distribution and ensure sustainable peasant production. By the late Western Han period, it was evident that imperial power rested not only on military strength or bureaucratic efficiency, but on the effective management of agrarian resources. Millions of cultivated fields supplied the grain, manpower, and fiscal foundation necessary to sustain both the army and the expanding administrative apparatus. The household-based system of taxation and production provided stability, yet its vulnerabilities highlighted the delicate balance between central authority, elite interests, and peasant productivity. To manage this agrarian base effectively, the Han state expanded its regulatory reach, integrating taxation, labor, and infrastructure within a centralized framework. The strategies developed during this period established enduring principles for agricultural governance, demonstrating how empire-scale administration relied fundamentally on the productivity and organization of its rural population. During the reign of Emperor Wu r. 141 to 87 BCE, the Han Dynasty confronted unprecedented fiscal demands. Military campaigns against the Xiongnu, the maintenance of frontier garrisons, and large-scale infrastructure projects required substantial and predictable revenue streams. To meet these needs, the imperial government established state monopolies over salt, iron, and coinage, marking a decisive shift toward interventionist economic policy. These monopolies centralized production and regulation, enhancing fiscal control while simultaneously generating ideological and social tension. Salt and iron were strategic resources vital to both the economy and the military. Salt provided essential dietary minerals and a preservative for grain, while iron underpinned agricultural tools, weaponry, and construction. Prior to state monopolies, production and distribution were largely in private hands, creating regional disparities and limiting imperial oversight. By asserting control, the Han state could direct supply, stabilize prices, and ensure that essential resources supported military and civil objectives. The establishment of the monopolies also extended to coinage. Standardized bronze coin minting was centralized in imperial foundries to regulate currency supply and maintain confidence in economic transactions. Archaeological evidence, including coin molds and metal scrap recovered from excavated Han mint sites, confirms the scale and sophistication of state-controlled production. Centralized minting facilitated taxation, commercial exchange, and the transfer of wealth to the imperial treasury, allowing the court to finance both domestic administration and border campaigns efficiently. Fiscal necessity was a primary justification for state intervention. The Han government faced mounting expenses related to long-term campaigns against nomadic incursions along the northern frontier, as well as domestic projects such as canal maintenance, granary management, and road construction. Textual records from the Han Shu indicate that private profits from salt and iron production were taxed inconsistently, reducing available revenue for strategic initiatives. By instituting monopolies, the state converted these critical industries into stable and predictable revenue sources. The policy of monopolization provoked significant debate, most notably recorded in the discourses on salt and iron, 81 BCE. Confucian scholars argued that state intervention in commerce violated moral governance principles, undermining ethical conduct and local autonomy. They contended that markets should be guided by virtue, not coercion, and that excessive extraction or price control would harm peasant and artisan communities. In contrast, legalist advisors emphasized fiscal and military necessity, arguing that centralization of production and distribution was indispensable to state survival. These discussions highlight the tension between ideology and pragmatism, demonstrating the Han court's need to reconcile moral philosophy with practical governance. Implementation of the monopolies required extensive administrative oversight. Imperial inspectors supervised salt and iron works, enforced production quotas, and monitored the quality and weight of coinage. Regional offices coordinated labor allocation, raw material procurement, and logistics. Excavated records from Han foundries indicate standardized procedures for casting, measurement, and accounting, illustrating the complexity of centrally managed industries. This administrative precision allowed the Han state to maintain control over both economic output and fiscal contribution across a vast territory. The monopolies had notable economic consequences. Centralized pricing and controlled distribution disrupted some local markets, particularly for small-scale producers previously engaged in salt and iron trade. Artisan mobility and entrepreneurial initiative were constrained, and urban centers often became dependent on state allocation for critical resources. Nevertheless, these policies enabled the government to maintain stable supplies for frontier garrisons and large-scale public works, prioritizing strategic objectives over short-term market freedom. Beyond revenue generation, the monopolies also reinforced imperial authority. Control over essential commodities symbolically demonstrated the emperor's capacity to regulate resources and mediate both economic and social order. By embedding production within the state apparatus, the Han Dynasty extended governance into daily life, making compliance with imperial directives integral to subsistence and trade. This integration of economic and political power strengthened both central oversight and the practical reach of the bureaucracy. State monopolies further contributed to fiscal innovation. Profits generated from salt and iron sales were stored in central treasuries, enabling the funding of future military campaigns and infrastructure projects without relying solely on periodic tax collection. Coinage standardization facilitated the circulation of wealth, reduced regional disparities, and improved market efficiency, reflecting the dual objectives of economic integration and state control. While the monopolies stabilized revenue and reinforced central authority, they also highlighted inherent tensions between imperial policy and local interests. Peasant households and small merchants faced new obligations and constraints, while regional elites saw their traditional privileges diminished. Historical accounts suggest that these economic pressures occasionally triggered localized unrest or petitions for reform, illustrating the delicate balance required to maintain both productivity and social stability. By the late 1st century BCE, the Han monopolies had institutionalized interventionist economics as a central feature of governance. Revenue collection was no longer a matter of voluntary contribution or local negotiation but a strategically managed function of state power. This system provided the fiscal foundation for military, administrative, and infrastructural expansion, while simultaneously embedding imperial authority into the economic life of the empire. The integration of salt, iron, and coinage under state control exemplified the Han approach to economic management: pragmatic, centralized, and strategically oriented. These measures enabled long-term planning, resource allocation, and territorial defense, demonstrating that economic policy was inseparable from both military necessity and ideological legitimacy. Centralized production became a tool of survival, reflecting the dynasty's recognition that sustaining imperial power required command over both land and material resources. With revenue secured through monopolies, the Han state could coordinate large-scale administration, fund frontier defense, and pursue trade and infrastructure initiatives. Economic integration, enforced through precise oversight, laid the groundwork for sustained territorial expansion and internal stability across the empire. Economic control in the Han Dynasty extended beyond taxation and monopolies to a comprehensive administrative framework that integrated demographic data, transportation infrastructure, and market oversight. Central to this system were detailed censuses, which allowed the imperial court to monitor population distribution, land holdings, and productive capacity across the empire. The household, or hu, remained the basic unit of record, and local magistrates maintained registers that were regularly transmitted to provincial and central authorities. These records were essential not only for taxation and corvée labor allocation but also for military conscription and strategic planning. The census conducted in 2 CE, which enumerated approximately 57 million people, represents the most complete surviving record of Han demographic administration. Transport infrastructure underpinned the mobility of both goods and state authority. The Han state invested heavily in the construction and maintenance of roads and canals, connecting agrarian hinterlands with urban centers, frontier garrisons, and ports. Excavations along the Wei and Yellow rivers reveal canal systems designed to transport grain from surplus regions to capitals and frontier locations, while paved roads facilitated the movement of officials, military units, and merchandise. This logistical network allowed the court to redistribute resources efficiently, mitigate regional scarcity, and enforce central policies across thousands of kilometers. Markets were closely regulated to support both fiscal stability and social order. Government-appointed officials monitored prices, weights, and measures, ensuring standardized transactions throughout the empire. Bronze weights, scales, and inscribed tally records recovered from Han sites demonstrate the sophistication of enforcement mechanisms and the importance of uniformity in commercial exchange. Standardization of currency further enhanced market reliability, while periodic inspections prevented fraudulent practices and maintained consumer confidence. The integration of oversight and infrastructure enabled the Han state to coordinate economic activity on a scale unprecedented in East Asia. The combination of census, transport, and market regulation facilitated the redistribution of surplus resources, especially grain. Granaries located in central provinces, urban centers, and frontier posts functioned both as buffers against famine and as instruments of state authority. During crop failures, officials dispatched food to affected regions, demonstrating the dual fiscal and social function of administrative networks. Archaeological evidence of storage pits, canal locks, and transport vessels corroborates textual accounts of these operations, confirming the practical implementation of a centrally coordinated logistical system. These systems were also critical for the support of frontier defense. Garrison troops along the northern borders and in newly conquered territories depended on consistent grain deliveries, coordinated via census data and transport routes. Supply chains were managed through a hierarchy of officials, from local magistrates to provincial governors, who ensured that quotas were met and logistical schedules adhered to. Disruptions to transport or market regulation were recorded and rectified through inspection tours and official reports, highlighting the state's capacity for oversight and intervention. Administrative precision extended into fiscal calculations. Market regulation enabled the state to levy taxes with predictable yields, while transport networks allowed for the collection and redistribution of revenue in both cash and in-kind forms. Grain, iron, and salt were moved to locations where they were most needed, whether for consumption, military use, or storage. Standardized measures, weights, and coinage facilitated these transfers, reducing opportunities for local corruption and inefficiency. The Han approach to regulation also reinforced social hierarchy and imperial ideology. By controlling essential commodities, transportation, and data collection, the state embedded authority into the daily economic lives of both urban and rural populations. Compliance with official regulations was interpreted as both a legal obligation and a moral duty, consistent with the integration of Confucian ethics into governance. Local officials not only implemented policy but acted as intermediaries between central authority and communities, transmitting imperial standards of conduct while resolving disputes arising from resource allocation. Infrastructure and administrative mechanisms further enabled long-distance trade and market integration. Goods produced in southern provinces, such as salt, iron, and agricultural surpluses, could be transported to northern and western regions through coordinated canals and roadways. This facilitated interregional exchange, encouraged specialization, and strengthened imperial control over economic activity. Excavated dockyards, road foundations, and warehouse structures indicate the scale and efficiency of these logistical networks. revealing the practical sophistication of Han state planning. By linking demographic data, transportation, and market oversight, the Han Dynasty achieved unprecedented economic coordination. Records, routes, and regulation formed a feedback system that allowed the court to respond to regional shortages, allocate labor and resources efficiently, and maintain both fiscal and social stability. This administrative capacity enabled the empire to project power over a vast territory, supporting military, infrastructure, and fiscal objectives. The integration of census data, transport infrastructure, and market regulation also set a precedent for the long-term administration of Imperial China. These mechanisms allowed the state to balance extraction with productivity, ensuring that both the peasantry and local markets remained functional components of empire-wide governance. By demonstrating the practical interdependence of data, movement, and commerce, the Han state institutionalized economic oversight as a core component of imperial authority. Through these combined mechanisms, the Han Dynasty reinforced both fiscal control and social integration. An empire moved as much on records as on roads. Census data guided policy, transportation enabled resource mobilization, and regulated markets ensured economic cohesion. Together, these systems established the infrastructure and administrative precision necessary for the functioning of a centralized, long-lived empire. The foundation of Han society rested on the organization of the household and the moral framework provided by Confucian ethics. Filial piety, patriarchal authority, and lineage continuity shaped social norms, governance expectations, and personal conduct. Families were more than private units. They were instruments of social stability, moral education, and administrative compliance, linking domestic order to broader imperial objectives. Households were typically patriarchal, with the eldest male acting as head and legal authority. He managed family property, mediated disputes among members, and represented the household in interactions with local officials. Genealogical records, funeral inscriptions, and family registers demonstrate the centrality of lineage, emphasizing continuity through male heirs and the preservation of ancestral memory. This emphasis on heredity was reinforced by legal codes, which granted the paterfamilias authority over marriage arrangements, property allocation, and disciplinary measures while framing these rights within moral obligations. Filial piety, or shao, was the cornerstone of family ethics. Children were expected to respect, obey, and care for their parents, a principle reinforced both socially and legally. The Han legal system penalized acts of disobedience and encouraged the maintenance of household harmony. Inscriptions on tombstones and memorial stelae frequently highlight filial acts, recording donations to ancestral temples or rites performed on behalf of parents. These practices illustrate how ethical obligations were materially and socially embedded, creating a moral infrastructure that guided everyday behavior. Lineage continuity extended beyond individual households to include extended family networks. Clans maintained records of births, deaths, and marriages to preserve collective memory and inheritance rights. Archaeological findings from tomb complexes reveal multi-generational burial arrangements that reflect hierarchical structuring within families. Ancestor worship, performed at domestic altars or larger clan shrines, reinforced intergenerational obligations and the integration of moral principles into ritual practice. These observances emphasized reciprocal duties. Descendants honored forebears, while the reputation of the lineage conferred social standing and political influence. Marriage arrangements reflected both social hierarchy and economic strategy. Families often arranged unions to consolidate property, establish alliances, or enhance social status. Legal codes recognized dowries, inheritance rights, and responsibilities for maintaining household order, codifying family ethics into enforceable norms. Historical documents, including the Han Shu, describe procedures for property transmission and dispute resolution, underscoring the intersection of moral expectation and bureaucratic oversight. The Confucian social framework reinforced broader societal hierarchies. Patriarchal households mirrored the structure of the state, with the emperor as moral head and local officials acting as intermediaries between central authority and population. The principles governing filial duty, loyalty, and hierarchical obedience were scaled from domestic units to villages, commanderies, and the imperial center, ensuring ideological consistency across social strata. By embedding governance ideals in the family, the state leveraged domestic structures as instruments of social stability and policy implementation. Daily life within households reflected these ethical priorities. Education, particularly in the classics, began in childhood, emphasizing moral cultivation alongside literacy and numeracy. Ritual practice marked seasonal cycles, life events, and ancestor veneration, integrating ethical instruction into practical action. Material culture, including household shrines, ancestral tablets, and inscriptions, demonstrates the physical manifestation of Confucian principles within domestic settings. The alignment of household activity with moral and administrative expectations reinforced the authority of both family elders and state officials. Gender roles were likewise structured by Confucian ethics. Women were subordinate to male heads of household but also responsible for maintaining domestic order, ritual observance, and child rearing. Legal documents codify their duties, including management of household labor, participation in ancestor worship, and transmission of ethical norms to children. Women of elite households often engaged in arranging marriages and preserving lineage reputation, illustrating the interplay between domestic influence and broader social obligations. The household also functioned as a basic economic unit. Peasant families cultivated land collectively, coordinated labor for agricultural production, and contributed surplus to local authorities through taxation. Artisans and merchants organized production along family lines, transmitting skills and property through inheritance. Archaeological evidence from domestic sites reveals storage pits, tools, and workshops integrated within household compounds, illustrating the interdependence of family, labor, and state obligations. Through these structures, the Han Dynasty ensured that moral, legal, and economic systems were mutually reinforcing. The household operated as a microcosm of imperial authority, linking private conduct to public stability. By codifying family ethics, regulating property, and standardizing lineage practices, the state leveraged domestic life as a mechanism of social control, ensuring compliance with Confucian norms and reinforcing hierarchical cohesion. By the end of the early Han period, the social order established through family structures provided a stable foundation for broader societal organization. Filial piety, patriarchal authority, and lineage continuity guided everyday behavior, codified legal practice, and underpinned ritual observance. These domestic norms shaped gender expectations, social mobility, and economic activity, creating a coherent framework within which the empire's population operated. Household structures, therefore, were not merely private arrangements but critical instruments of imperial governance, linking the ethical, legal, and economic dimensions of Han society. Gender roles were structured by Confucian ethics and codified in legal texts, establishing a framework of patriarchal authority while simultaneously providing avenues for female influence within specific spheres. Women were expected to maintain household order, oversee domestic labor, and ensure continuity of lineage through childbearing and education of children in moral conduct. At the same time, historical records and archaeological evidence indicate that elite women exercised political, economic, and social agency in ways that shaped the course of the dynasty. Marriage arrangements reflected the centrality of household and lineage interests. Families, particularly among the gentry and nobility, arranged unions to consolidate property, form political alliances, and maintain social status. Legal codes outline dowry obligations, inheritance rights, and responsibilities for maintaining domestic harmony, reinforcing the subordinate but legally recognized position of women within the family hierarchy. Tomb inscriptions and funerary artifacts often document the lineage and marital connections of women, illustrating both their relational importance and the social expectations imposed upon them. Women's property rights were limited but not absent. Textual sources, including the Han legal statutes, indicate that women could inherit dowry property and, in some circumstances, manage household assets on behalf of their husbands or sons. Elite women often supervised family estates, coordinated labor, and oversaw agricultural production or artisan workshops, exercising administrative authority within the domestic sphere. Archaeological evidence, such as labeled storage vessels, account tallies, and estate-related artifacts from tombs, demonstrates women's involvement in economic management and the transmission of property across generations. Political agency was most visible among women of the imperial household. Empress Lu Ji r. 188 to 180 BCE provides a notable example of female influence in governance. Following the death of Emperor Gaozu, Lu effectively controlled succession, directed court appointments, and managed palace affairs. Contemporary chronicles describe her manipulation of bureaucratic networks and strategic consolidation of power, demonstrating that women could exercise authority through institutional channels, even within a predominantly patriarchal system. Such examples reveal that the formal restriction of women's roles coexisted with practical opportunities for significant impact, particularly within elite and courtly contexts. Legal texts also regulated women's conduct in alignment with Confucian ideals. Disobedience toward husbands or fathers, abandonment of domestic duties, and failure to uphold ritual obligations could incur social or legal sanctions. At the same time, norms emphasized moral virtue, filial duty, and the protection of family honor. Tomb inscriptions frequently commemorate women's piety, filial devotion, and contributions to family ritual, highlighting both the ethical expectations and the avenues for recognition and influence available to them. Women's social presence extended into ritual and religious practices. Household altars, ancestral temples, and funerary offerings often required female participation in maintenance, sacrifice preparation, and the transmission of ritual knowledge to younger generations. Archaeological findings, including ceramic figurines, bronze ritual implements, and engraved ancestral tablets, indicate that women played active roles in sustaining ritual continuity and reinforcing lineage cohesion. These activities complemented their domestic responsibilities, linking ethical, religious, and social functions within the household. In non-elite contexts, women's agency was more constrained, but evidence from legal petitions, regional histories, and material culture suggests that rural and artisan women contributed to household economies and participated in local trade or craft production. They were involved in weaving, textile preparation, food processing, and small-scale market exchanges, demonstrating that economic contribution extended beyond purely domestic duties. These activities, while often unrecorded in elite chronicles, were critical for household survival and the functioning of local economies. Despite these limitations, the Han period demonstrates a balance of authority and restriction. Patriarchal hierarchies defined legal and social expectations, yet women exercised influence within households, estates, and courts. Elite women could direct policy indirectly, manage significant assets, and maintain lineage continuity, while ordinary women contributed to production, ritual, and family cohesion. Legal and social frameworks both constrained and enabled agency, revealing the dual nature of gender roles in Han society. By the end of the early Han period, the gendered division of labor, coupled with codified legal and ethical norms, created a structured yet dynamic social environment. Authority and limitation coexisted within the household, shaping marital relations, inheritance, ritual observance, and political influence. These patterns illustrate how Confucian social values were operationalized in both elite and ordinary contexts, embedding gender expectations into the moral, legal, and economic life of the empire. The interplay of restriction and agency among Han women also influenced broader cultural practices. Household organization, material culture, and ritual observance were all informed by gender roles, reflecting societal values that integrated morality, family responsibility, and social hierarchy. These dynamics laid the foundation for subsequent Han cultural norms, providing a consistent framework through which women's roles were understood, managed, and occasionally transformed. Han burial practices provide critical insight into the social hierarchy, ideological beliefs, and technological capabilities of the period. Tomb architecture and grave goods were carefully regulated to reflect rank, family status, and moral virtue, embedding social and cosmological principles into material culture. Elite burials, in particular, functioned as both symbols of prestige and instruments for perpetuating lineage memory, demonstrating the intersection of ideology, economy, and craftsmanship. Tomb construction varied with social status. Elite tombs were often large, multi-chambered structures with brick, stone, or wooden frameworks designed to house both the deceased and extensive grave goods. Archaeological sites such as the tombs at Manching, the burial place of Prince Liu Shang, and Mawangdui, the resting place of Lady Dai, provide unparalleled evidence of architectural sophistication. These sites reveal complex layouts with designated spaces for personal items, ritual implements, and symbolic representations of domestic life, reflecting the belief that the afterlife mirrored earthly existence. Grave goods illustrate both material culture and social ideology. Jade burial suits, sometimes comprising thousands of carefully sewn jade plaques, were reserved for high-ranking individuals, representing purity, preservation of the body, and protection from malevolent forces. Lacquerware, silk textiles, bronze vessels, and ritual implements accompanied the deceased, emphasizing wealth, status, and moral virtue. Excavations at Mawangdui uncovered an array of such items, including lacquered tables, musical instruments, and finely preserved silk garments, demonstrating both technological achievement and aesthetic sophistication. Models of estates, workshops, and servant figurines were commonly included in tombs, symbolically replicating the household and social environment of the deceased. These miniatures, crafted in pottery, wood, or bronze, reflect the importance of maintaining hierarchy, labor systems, and domestic routines in the afterlife. Funerary inscriptions often identified the deceased's achievements, rank, and familial relationships, reinforcing social memory and the continuity of lineage. Such material culture served as both ideological reinforcement and a practical representation of elite expectations regarding morality, service, and domestic management. Burial practices also reveal cosmological beliefs. The arrangement of tomb chambers, orientation of burials, and inclusion of ritual implements were designed to harmonize with cosmic principles. For instance, jade was associated with immortality and spiritual protection, while lacquered objects resisted decay, preserving both physical items and symbolic meaning. Astronomical motifs and representations of celestial deities in tomb decorations illustrate an integration of cosmology with funerary ideology, reflecting the Han understanding of life, death, and cosmic order. Archaeological evidence confirms that burial customs were also a mechanism for social differentiation. Elite tombs were larger, more richly furnished, and often accompanied by human or animal sacrifices, while commoners received simpler interments with limited goods. Inscriptions and recovered texts, including funerary epitaphs and estate inventories, demonstrate a codification of status, reinforcing societal hierarchy even in death. This stratification indicates that material culture functioned as a tangible manifestation of political and social order, echoing the authority exercised in life. Technological innovation played a key role in these funerary practices. Lacquer techniques, textile weaving, metal casting, and jade carving required specialized skills, coordinated labor, and access to regional resources. The presence of imported materials, such as foreign silks or exotic stones, reflects the integration of Han domestic and long-distance trade networks. These artifacts provide evidence of both economic reach and the sophistication of Han craftsmanship, highlighting the interplay between material culture and imperial administration. The careful planning of burials illustrates the broader social and political functions of mortuary practice. Tombs were not only repositories for the deceased but also sites for ancestral worship, moral instruction, and the reinforcement of family cohesion. Ritual offerings and commemorative ceremonies connected living descendants with their forebears, embedding Confucian principles of filial piety and moral continuity into everyday social life. Bronze vessels, incense burners, and ritual paraphernalia demonstrate the systematic enactment of these obligations, linking material culture to ethical and administrative norms. Burial practices extended to political symbolism. The display of wealth, access to specialized craftsmanship, and inclusion of ritual implements communicated rank, legitimacy, and moral standing. Imperial tombs, in particular, showcased both personal authority and dynastic power. The terracotta army, while associated with Qin precedents, influenced Han funerary strategies by emphasizing scale, organization, and the projection of authority beyond death. These practices reinforced the relationship between ideology, governance, and social hierarchy, demonstrating that the care of the dead was inseparable from the management of the living. By codifying burial practices, the Han Dynasty created a durable system of social memory, ideological representation, and technological demonstration. Tomb architecture, grave goods, and associated rituals reflected cosmology, moral expectation, and social hierarchy. Archaeological discoveries at sites like Mwangdui and Manching illuminate the intersection of material culture with imperial ideology, revealing how elite identity, craftsmanship, and ritual precision expressed both authority and cosmological order. These beliefs and practices surrounding death had broader implications for the organization of society. The meticulous planning of tombs, inclusion of status markers, and replication of household structures in miniature informed contemporary understandings of hierarchy, labor, and administration. The attention to ritual precision in burial practice anticipated similar methods in military organization, reinforcing the principle that order, discipline, and planning were central to both civic and martial governance. The Han Dynasty maintained a complex military apparatus designed to secure imperial borders, suppress internal disorder, and support territorial expansion. Military organization combined permanent standing units with conscripted levies drawn from the agrarian population. The household remained the primary administrative unit for conscription, with local officials responsible for compiling registers and ensuring compliance. Census data and land surveys facilitated the identification of eligible males, typically between the ages of 18 and 30, who could be summoned for service. While conscription remained obligatory, exemptions were granted for key economic responsibilities, such as maintaining agricultural production, illustrating the interdependence of military and fiscal priorities. Conscription systems were supplemented by professional armies stationed at strategic locations across the empire. These permanent forces, commanded by provincial and regional generals, provided rapid response capabilities and a nucleus of trained personnel to support newly levied troops. Textual records indicate a dual structure in which local militias reinforced frontier garrisons, while centrally coordinated units under imperial authority maintained strategic mobility and readiness. This combination allowed the Han Dynasty to deploy forces efficiently across diverse terrain, from river valleys to frontier steppes, ensuring both defensive and offensive capabilities. The Han military was organized hierarchically, with clearly delineated ranks and responsibilities. Generals commanded armies divided into units of standardized size, each with subordinate officers responsible for discipline, logistics, and training. Administrative manuals recovered from Han tombs provide detailed instructions on troop organization, battlefield formations, and supply management. Such documents illustrate the dynasty's emphasis on coordination, communication, and chain of command, ensuring that conscripted forces could operate effectively alongside professional soldiers. Weapons technology and training were essential components of military readiness. Iron swords, polearms, crossbows, and protective armor were standardized to improve battlefield effectiveness. Archaeological finds, including weapons caches and armor fragments from frontier sites, demonstrate the scale and sophistication of production. Crossbow deployment, in particular, enhanced tactical flexibility and allowed for coordinated volleys that could disrupt massed enemy formations. Training emphasized both individual skill and unit cohesion, with drills conducted regularly to maintain proficiency and discipline. To support frontier operations and secure supply lines, the Han implemented military colonies known as tunshin. These colonies combined agricultural production with garrison duties, allowing soldiers to cultivate land while maintaining readiness. Located in border regions, tunshin settlements ensured self-sufficiency, reduced reliance on distant supply chains, and provided a mechanism for consolidating territorial control. Archaeological surveys of tunshin sites reveal organized fields, irrigation infrastructure, and defensive works, highlighting the integration of military and agrarian planning. Logistical organization was critical for extended campaigns. The transport of food, weapons, and equipment relied on road networks, river systems, and pack animals, coordinated through local and provincial administrations. Imperial inspectors monitored supply depots and transport schedules, ensuring that both conscripts and professional troops were adequately provisioned. Textual records describe the movement of tens of thousands of troops across difficult terrain, demonstrating the administrative sophistication necessary for sustained military operations. The conscription system also incorporated seasonal service, allowing peasants to fulfill obligations without entirely abandoning agricultural production. Rotation schedules, exemptions, and local levies were carefully calculated to balance military necessity with economic stability. This dual obligation of labor and service reinforced the integration of state power into the everyday lives of the population, reflecting the Han emphasis on administrative coordination and the fusion of civic and military responsibilities. Strategically, the Han army was deployed to address both internal and external threats. Frontier garrisons defended against nomadic incursions, while mobile units conducted punitive campaigns, reconnaissance, and fortification construction. Commanders relied on detailed intelligence gathered through local networks and reconnaissance missions, enabling preemptive action against potential incursions. Military manuals emphasize the importance of terrain, timing, and formation, illustrating a disciplined approach to warfare rooted in both theoretical and practical knowledge. The hierarchical organization of the Han military allowed the central government to maintain control over provincial armies, preventing the emergence of regional power bases that could challenge imperial authority. Generals were rotated, and appointments were made with reference to both merit and loyalty, reducing the likelihood of rebellion. This system combined administrative oversight with practical command structures, ensuring that the army functioned as an instrument of both defense and centralized power. By the late 1st century BCE, the Han military had become a permanent institution embedded in state infrastructure. The combination of conscripted levies, professional forces, logistical planning, and frontier colonies provided a versatile system capable of responding to both internal unrest and external threats. Standardized training, weaponry, and command protocols enabled coordinated action, while administrative oversight ensured efficiency and compliance. Military readiness thus became inseparable from broader state control, linking territorial expansion to governance and economic organization. The Han army structure reflects the integration of conscription, professionalization, and logistical innovation. Expansion required permanent readiness. An empire's ability to defend, extend, and administer its territory depended not solely on manpower but on coordination, supply, and discipline. Census data informed recruitment, Tunshan colonies sustained frontier posts, and standardized units ensured tactical effectiveness. This combination of administrative and martial mechanisms underpinned the dynasty's capacity to maintain order and project power over a vast territory. With military structures institutionalized, the Han Dynasty was prepared to confront the most significant challenge of its early imperial era, managing nomadic incursions beyond the northern frontier and consolidating control over newly acquired territories. The integration of conscription, professional armies, and logistical networks provided a foundation for campaigns that would shape the empire's borders, fiscal capacity, and strategic posture for generations. The Han Dynasty's northern frontier faced sustained pressure from the Xiongnu, a confederation of nomadic steppe tribes whose mobility, cavalry expertise, and decentralized political structure posed a persistent challenge to imperial authority. The early Han emperors initially sought to mitigate conflict through diplomacy and marriage alliances known as hachin, offering gifts and imperial women in exchange for peace. These arrangements provided temporary reprieve but did not resolve the structural tension between a sedentary agrarian state and the mobile, raiding economy of the steppe. By the reign of Emperor Wu R. 141 to 87 BCE, the Han adopted a more assertive military strategy. Campaigns aimed to secure borders, disrupt Xiongnu supply lines, and assert imperial control over strategic passes and trade corridors. The army relied on both conscripted levies and professional units stationed at fortified garrisons, coordinated through a network of roads and frontier colonies. Cavalry units, trained to mirror the mobility of nomadic forces, became central to these operations. Textual accounts in the Hanshu document the organization of mounted troops, the use of signal flags for coordination, and the logistical challenges of operating in sparsely settled steppe regions. Generals Wei Qing and Hua Tubing exemplify the operational and tactical innovation of Han campaigns. Wei Qing, commanding forces in multiple northern expeditions, established fortified outposts and conducted raids that disrupted Xiongnu supply chains, compelling the Confederation to engage on terms favorable to the Han. Quetzubing, noted for his rapid cavalry assaults, achieved decisive victories in the Heshi Corridor, capturing strategic territory and securing access to previously contested regions. These campaigns relied on precise coordination, intelligence gathering, and supply chain management, demonstrating the integration of administrative oversight with battlefield strategy. Archaeological evidence supports textual descriptions of these operations. Excavations along the northern frontier reveal fortifications, watchtowers, and signaling stations designed to monitor movements and transmit orders across vast distances. Weapon caches, horse trappings, and armor fragments demonstrate the scale and material sophistication of cavalry units. These findings underscore the logistical and technological preparation necessary to sustain prolonged military engagement against a mobile adversary. The conflict also involved adaptive strategies in response to environmental and cultural differences. Xiongnu mobility, reliance on horses, and flexible command structures required the Han to develop rapid response units capable of pursuing raiding parties across desert and steppe terrain. Supply depots and Tunshan agricultural colonies ensured that troops remained provisioned even in remote areas. Textual records describe measures such as prepositioning food and equipment, rotating units, and employing intelligence networks among local populations, reflecting systematic planning and administrative competence. Han victories gradually shifted the regional power balance. The defeat of major Xiongnu forces in campaigns led by Wei Qing and Quetzubing compelled the Confederation to relocate their main base northward, reducing the frequency of large-scale incursions into the agrarian core. Strategic control of the Heshi Corridor opened overland trade routes, later incorporated into what would become the Silk Road, linking the empire to Central Asia and beyond. These developments not only secured territorial boundaries but also facilitated economic integration and political influence across Inner Asia. Diplomacy continued alongside military campaigns. Following decisive battles, the Han negotiated treaties with subordinate Xiongnu groups, exchanging gifts, hostages, and ceremonial recognition. Such agreements reinforced imperial prestige, stabilized frontier populations, and integrated distant regions into a broader geopolitical framework. By combining military and diplomatic pressure, the Han established a durable northern frontier, extending the empire's capacity for administration, taxation, and trade. The wars against the Xiongnu also had lasting effects on internal military organization. The challenges of steppe warfare accelerated the development of cavalry units, refined command hierarchies, and emphasized intelligence and logistics. Lessons learned in these campaigns informed subsequent frontier policies, garrison placements, and the coordination of professional and conscripted forces. The integration of administrative oversight with operational flexibility became a hallmark of Han military practice. By the end of the mid-Han period, the dynasty had transformed its northern defense from reactive diplomacy into a coordinated military and administrative system. The combination of fortifications, mobile cavalry, strategic colonies, and integrated logistics enabled the empire to project power across diverse terrain while maintaining internal stability. Victory over the Xiongnu demonstrated that a sedentary agrarian empire could counter the threats of nomadic confederations through planning, discipline, and infrastructure, rather than relying solely on martial valor or temporary alliances. The success of these campaigns had broader implications for Han governance. Military conquest secured territorial administration, facilitated trade, and reinforced imperial legitimacy. Frontier defense became inseparable from bureaucratic planning, demonstrating that territorial expansion required not only force but also precise logistical and administrative support. The integration of military strategy with state structures laid the foundation for the enduring Han presence in northern China and the corridors connecting East and Central Asia. In sum, the Han-Xiongnu Wars exemplify the intersection of military innovation, administrative coordination, and geopolitical strategy. The steppe tested the limits of empire, compelling the Han to adapt tactics, integrate supply systems, and harmonize diplomacy with warfare. These campaigns established patterns of frontier management, cavalry deployment, and long-distance governance that shaped the trajectory of the dynasty for generations. Military success in these regions was inseparable from broader territorial administration, demonstrating the inseparable link between battlefield achievement and the consolidation of imperial authority. The territorial expansion of the Han Dynasty was accompanied by systematic colonization and administrative integration of newly acquired lands. Following military campaigns against the Xiongnu in the north and expeditions to southern regions such as Lingnan and Yunnan, the Han established commanderies Jun as fundamental units of frontier governance. Each commandery was overseen by a centrally appointed administrator responsible for taxation, legal oversight, military coordination, and social management. This structure allowed the central government to extend authority into previously autonomous or semi-independent regions, creating a direct line of imperial control. Colonization efforts relied heavily on the migration of settlers, often including soldiers, their families, and incentivized peasant households. These migrants established agricultural settlements, cultivated local lands, and maintained garrisoned fortifications. Military colonies, or tunshin, were strategically placed to secure supply lines, stabilize populations, and protect trade routes. Archaeological surveys in the Heshi Corridor and along the Han southern frontiers reveal settlement patterns characterized by organized fields, irrigation infrastructure, defensive works, and standardized housing, demonstrating the dual function of colonies as both agricultural units and instruments of state authority. Commanderies were organized to balance military, civil, and fiscal responsibilities. Administrators coordinated local militias, supervised taxation and labor obligations, and enforced imperial law. Census data informed recruitment, resource allocation, and local governance, ensuring that the frontier remained integrated with the broader empire. Local populations, including indigenous communities, were incorporated through treaties, tributary arrangements, or settlement policies that encouraged assimilation into Han culture. Inscriptions, official reports, and regional gazetteers illustrate these processes, documenting the expansion of Han institutions across diverse geographies. Cultural integration accompanied administrative oversight. Migrant populations introduced Han customs, Confucian ethical norms, and agricultural practices, while local populations contributed knowledge of terrain, climate, and resource management. Marriage alliances between Han settlers and indigenous families facilitated social cohesion and reinforced imperial authority. Archaeological evidence, including ceramic styles, ritual paraphernalia, and domestic architecture, demonstrates the blending of Han and local traditions, producing hybrid cultural forms that stabilized frontier societies while maintaining allegiance to the central government. The establishment of commanderies also involved significant economic planning. Settlers were responsible for producing grain and other resources to support both civilian populations and garrison troops. Tax obligations were adjusted to account for local productivity and environmental conditions. Infrastructure projects, including roads, canals, and watchtowers, facilitated the movement of goods, personnel, and military reinforcements. Textual records emphasize the coordination required between central authorities, regional administrators, and local communities to sustain these frontier settlements over extended periods. While colonization extended Han influence, it also imposed administrative and logistical challenges. Frontier populations were dispersed, communication was slow, and environmental conditions often differed markedly from central regions. Seasonal floods, arid terrain, and tropical disease affected agricultural output and troop readiness. Administrators needed to balance military imperatives with economic viability, adjusting labor allocations, crop selection, and settlement patterns to ensure long-term sustainability. Reports from Han historians note periodic unrest, rebellion, and resistance by indigenous communities, highlighting the limits of imperial control in remote regions. The interaction between military and civil structures was particularly pronounced in the northwest. Fortified commanderies along the Heshi Corridor acted as both defensive posts against nomadic incursions and staging grounds for further expansion. Garrison troops supervised settler activities, managed irrigation projects, and monitored trade routes. These sites became nodes for long-distance commerce, linking China's interior to Central Asia. Archaeological findings of roads, beacon towers, and imported goods illustrate the dual role of frontier settlements as military infrastructure and conduits for economic exchange. Southern colonization required adaptation to different ecological and cultural environments. Administrators in Lingnan, Yunnan, and other southern regions encountered dense forests, riverine systems, and decentralized local polities. Settlement patterns relied on river transport, terraced agriculture, and coordination with local elites. Han migrants introduced new farming techniques, legal structures, and ritual practices, gradually integrating these regions into the imperial system. Funerary artifacts, domestic tools, and ceramic styles indicate that cultural blending was essential to consolidating authority without provoking continuous conflict. Frontier commanderies thus served multiple functions: military security, agricultural production, cultural integration, and administrative extension of imperial power. Settlers acted as agents of state policy, while local populations provided labor, knowledge, and legitimacy. The careful planning of settlement location, infrastructure, and governance demonstrates the Han Dynasty's sophisticated approach to managing distant territories. These frontier regions became laboratories for the implementation of state policy, testing the limits of bureaucratic reach and logistical coordination. By the end of the mid-Han period, the system of frontier commanderies and colonization had transformed the geopolitical landscape. Imperial authority extended beyond traditional heartlands, incorporating diverse peoples and environments under a common administrative framework. Empire followed the soldier. Military presence enabled settlement, governance, and cultural integration, linking territorial control with political, economic, and social structures. These mechanisms laid the foundation for stable imperial borders and facilitated trade, communication, and cultural exchange across East and Central Asia. The integration of frontier territories into the Han Empire illustrates the interdependence of military conquest, administrative innovation, and cultural assimilation. Colonization reinforced imperial authority while generating new logistical and political challenges, demonstrating that expansion required not only force but also planning, settlement, and social management. These frontiers would continue to serve as conduits for commerce, communication, and military projection, shaping the strategic and economic trajectory of the dynasty for generations. The opening of Central Asia to Han China was largely shaped by the missions of Zhang Qian, dispatched by Emperor Wu between 138 and 126 BCE. His journeys were intended initially to form alliances with the Yuezhi, a displaced Central Asian group, against the Xiongnu Confederation. While the alliances were only partially realized, Zhang Qian's observations provided unprecedented intelligence about the geography, political organization, and economic potential of Central Asian polities, fundamentally influencing Han foreign policy and imperial strategy. Zhang Qian's expeditions traversed regions corresponding to modern-day Xinjiang, Turkmenistan, and northern Afghanistan, exposing him and the imperial court to a variety of urban centers, tribal federations, and trading networks. Reports describe the Fergana Valley, Bactria, and Sogdiana as agriculturally productive and commercially active, with established routes linking East, Central, and South Asia. These accounts enabled the Han administration to map the logistical and political landscape of distant territories, including their capacity for military support, tribute relations, and trade integration. The missions also revealed the presence of intermediary states that could facilitate or impede trade. Zhang Qian documented city-states with fortified settlements, local rulers, and military levies, as well as nomadic pastoralists controlling steppe corridors. These insights allowed the Han court to evaluate which regions could serve as reliable partners or required military escort for caravans. Such intelligence informed both diplomatic engagements and the deployment of garrisons to protect Chinese interests, highlighting the strategic interdependence of information and imperial projection. Zhang Qian's reports emphasized the wealth and resources available in Central Asia, including horses, precious metals, textiles, and exotic goods. The Han valued superior breeds of horses for cavalry development, addressing both military and frontier security needs. Textual sources note the emperor's interest in procuring heavenly horses from Fergana to strengthen frontier garrisons, demonstrating how information from distant lands was translated into concrete policy decisions linking military capability with economic acquisition. The missions also provided detailed ethnographic and cultural information. Zhang Qian described customs, religious practices, governance structures, and settlement patterns of the populations he encountered. This information allowed the Han administration to anticipate negotiation challenges, identify local hierarchies, and adapt diplomatic strategies to align with indigenous protocols. Archaeological evidence from Central Asia corroborates the presence of Han goods, suggesting early contact and exchange following his missions. The journey was not without peril. Zhang Qian was captured by Xiongnu forces for over a decade before escaping to continue his return to China. His persistence and the information he brought back underscored both the hazards of long-distance diplomacy and the strategic value of first-hand intelligence. Han chronicles detail his observations regarding terrain, climate, and logistical challenges, enabling planners to better prepare for future missions and trade expeditions. By reporting on potential allies, commercial routes, and natural resources, Zhang Qian reshaped Han foreign relations. The court increasingly pursued a combination of diplomacy, military presence, and trade facilitation to secure strategic corridors connecting the empire with distant polities. The opening of Central Asia set the stage for regular exchanges of goods, knowledge, and personnel along routes that would eventually be formalized as the Silk Road. Zhang Qian's missions also influenced ideological perceptions of empire. Knowledge of distant lands underscored the Han Emperor's role as a mediator of power and culture, not only within the agrarian heartland but across broader Eurasian networks. The integration of this information into policy demonstrates the interplay of reconnaissance, diplomacy, and imperial ambition, revealing how geographic intelligence shaped both military planning and economic strategy. In conclusion, Zhang Qian's expeditions exemplify the transformative role of exploration and intelligence in early Han foreign relations. Knowledge expanded imperial horizons, providing the court with practical guidance for diplomacy, trade, and military planning. These missions established the foundation for systematic engagement with Central Asia, linking Han China to a network of polities, trade routes, and resources that would sustain imperial influence and economic exchange for centuries. The combination of first-hand observation, strategic reporting, and subsequent policy application illustrates the Han Dynasty's capacity to translate information into governance and long-term imperial advantage. The emergence of the Silk Road under the Han Dynasty transformed both the economic and cultural landscape of Eurasia. Following Zhang Qian's missions, trade networks developed linking China's heartland with Central Asia, India, and the Mediterranean. These routes facilitated the movement of luxury goods, raw materials, and technology, creating an interconnected economic system that extended imperial influence far beyond immediate borders. Silk was the primary commodity driving early Han trade. Produced in imperial workshops and private households, silk fabric was exported to Central Asian states, Bactria, and beyond. Archaeological finds, including textile remnants at sites in Xinjiang and Central Asia, confirm the wide distribution of Han silk. Silk served multiple functions: as diplomatic tribute, commercial merchandise, and material for elite consumption. Its value and portability made it a catalyst for long-distance exchange, integrating Han China into a transcontinental network. Horses, particularly the so-called heavenly horses of Fergana, were equally critical. Superior breeds were acquired both through purchase and military campaigns, enhancing Han cavalry capabilities on the northern frontier. These exchanges demonstrate the intersection of trade and military strategy, as securing reliable mounts directly impacted frontier defense, garrison mobility, and the projection of imperial power. Other commodities, such as glassware, precious metals, gemstones, and spices, traveled westward from China and eastward from Central Asia and India. Excavations along the Silk Road have uncovered Roman glass, silver coins, and Greco-Bactrian artifacts in Han tombs, illustrating the extensive circulation of goods. Conversely, Chinese goods, bronze mirrors, lacquerware, and ceramics, appear in Central Asian settlements, confirming reciprocal flows. These material exchanges reflect both economic interdependence and cultural transmission. Trade routes were carefully structured to navigate geographic challenges. Caravans followed river valleys, mountain passes, and steppe corridors, supported by a network of oases and fortified settlements. Administrative oversight ensured the safety of merchants and the regulation of taxation. Archaeological evidence indicates the presence of Han-style roads, way stations, and granaries, facilitating both commercial and military movement. Local intermediaries, including nomadic tribes, played a crucial role in mediating exchange, collecting tolls, and providing logistical support. Cultural exchange accompanied material trade. Ideas, religious practices, artistic motifs, and technologies moved along these routes. Buddhist artifacts appearing in Chinese frontier sites centuries later have their earliest traces in these initial interactions. Similarly, metallurgy, coinage techniques, and textile designs show evidence of cross-cultural borrowing. Written records indicate that Han officials monitored these exchanges to assess political, economic, and technological developments in foreign lands, integrating foreign knowledge into domestic policy. Archaeological finds from sites such as Naya, Lulan, and Turfan illustrate the integration of diverse artistic styles, religious iconography, and material technologies. Han ceramics alongside Central Asian metalwork demonstrate hybridization in craft practices, while inscriptions in multiple languages indicate the coexistence of diverse commercial and administrative systems. These examples underscore the depth of interconnectivity, highlighting the Silk Road as more than a trade route. It was a conduit for knowledge, innovation, and cultural synthesis. The impact of trade on Han society extended to taxation, state finance, and frontier administration. Commodities transported along these routes generated revenue through duties, controlled markets, and official monopolies. This flow of goods reinforced the need for sophisticated logistics, including the coordination of caravan routes, storage facilities, and security patrols. Trade thus intertwined with broader imperial infrastructure, linking economic activity with military, administrative, and political control. By the late Han period, Silk Road exchanges had produced a durable system of economic and cultural integration. Objects traveled farther than armies, connecting distant polities and shaping interregional relationships. The circulation of silk, horses, metals, and luxury goods reinforced Han influence across Central Asia, while local intermediaries facilitated both commerce and diplomacy. This system exemplifies how material exchange could extend imperial presence and create durable patterns of connectivity over vast distances. The establishment of these networks also had long-term consequences for imperial governance. Trade required oversight, standardization of weights and measures, and the protection of routes, reinforcing bureaucratic authority. Cultural encounters necessitated diplomatic skill and informed strategic planning. The combination of economic integration, military security, and cultural exchange demonstrates that the Silk Road was both a commercial and administrative instrument, enhancing Han power and facilitating interaction across Eurasia. In conclusion, the movement of goods along the Silk Road exemplifies the interdependence of economy, diplomacy, and culture in Han foreign relations. Trade increased imperial complexity, requiring coordination between frontier administration, military protection, and domestic governance. The circulation of silk, horses, and exotic commodities not only enriched the empire materially but also produced lasting cultural and technological exchanges, establishing patterns that would endure for centuries. The Han Dynasty's expansion beyond China's core regions required the establishment of political relationships with peripheral polities. These interactions were formalized through a system of tributary relations, whereby border states acknowledged Han supremacy in exchange for gifts, trade access, and diplomatic recognition. Such arrangements were particularly important in regions corresponding to modern Korea, northern Vietnam, and Central Asia, where local elites maintained relative autonomy but relied on Han political and economic support to consolidate their authority. In the northeast, the Han engaged with the Korean kingdoms of Goguryeo, Bio, and other minor polities. Military expeditions and garrison colonies were complemented by diplomatic missions that reinforced the hierarchical framework of the tributary system. Local rulers sent envoys bearing gifts and received imperial seals and ceremonial robes, symbolizing political recognition and submission. Textual sources, such as the Han Shu, describe these interactions as both ritualized and pragmatic, reflecting the Han court's dual aim of asserting authority and securing strategic frontier security. In the south, the annexation of Nam Viet, modern northern Vietnam, required both military pacification and integration into imperial administrative structures. Tributes from the region included local products, such as precious metals and exotic goods, which were incorporated into imperial markets. Simultaneously, Han administrators introduced taxation systems, military garrisons, and agricultural oversight, blending coercion with exchange. Archaeological findings, including Han-style bronze implements and ceramic imports, indicate the penetration of Han material culture into these tributary regions. Central Asian polities also participated in tributary exchange. Following Zhang Qian's reconnaissance and subsequent military campaigns, Han officials negotiated arrangements with oasis city-states along the Hushi Corridor and Fergana Valley. These states provided tribute in the form of local goods, horses, and allegiance, while retaining internal autonomy. Diplomatic missions formalized these relationships, using ceremonial protocols, seals, and written agreements to integrate distant polities into a hierarchical international order that projected Han authority without requiring constant occupation. Tributary relations combined elements of coercion, economic exchange, and ritual performance. While local rulers retained autonomy, they were expected to acknowledge Han superiority through annual or periodic tribute missions. Failure to comply could invite military intervention or sanctions, demonstrating the thin line between diplomacy and force. Textual records highlight that imperial envoys were trained to assess both loyalty and the political stability of these regions, ensuring that tribute served as a mechanism for projecting soft and hard power simultaneously. The tributary system also facilitated trade and cultural exchange. Envoys and gifts carried not only economic value but also knowledge, ceremonial practices, and technical expertise. Central Asian artisans, merchants, and scholars interacted with Han officials, producing hybrid cultural forms and contributing to the diffusion of technology, writing systems, and artistic motifs. Archaeological evidence, including imported glass, coins, and ceramics, demonstrates the material consequences of tributary diplomacy, revealing networks of interconnected economic and cultural influence. Strategically, these relationships strengthened Han control over key trade corridors and natural resources. By formalizing allegiance, the dynasty reduced the likelihood of rebellion or alliance with hostile powers. Tributes often supported the provisioning of garrisons, infrastructure maintenance, and local administration. This approach allowed the Han to maintain influence across vast distances without the constant expenditure required for full military occupation, combining diplomacy, trade, and administrative oversight into a cohesive frontier policy. Tributary relations also reinforced the ideological framework of imperial authority. Submission was negotiated, but it also symbolized recognition of the emperor's cosmic and moral mandate. Receiving tribute validated the emperor's status as the ultimate arbiter of political hierarchy, extending Han influence symbolically as well as practically. Ritualized reception of envoys, recording of gifts, and the granting of imperial seals conveyed legitimacy to both domestic and foreign audiences. By the end of the Han Dynasty's peak expansion, tributary diplomacy had created a layered system of influence across East and Central Asia. Border states provided resources, trade, and strategic depth, while remaining under nominal imperial control. These arrangements allowed the Han to project power efficiently, maintain frontier security, and integrate diverse regions into a broader imperial network. The system combined coercion, negotiation, and exchange, demonstrating the dynasty's capacity to balance force and diplomacy in managing complex international relations. The establishment of tributary networks exemplifies the Han approach to governance beyond the heartland. Military success, economic integration, and ritualized diplomacy converged to extend imperial influence. These border systems reinforced strategic objectives, facilitated commerce and cultural transmission, and provided an institutional framework that allowed the dynasty to exercise authority over distant regions with minimal direct occupation. As a result, the peak of territorial expansion carried both practical benefits and administrative responsibilities, foreshadowing the challenges of maintaining such a vast imperial order. The reign of Emperor Wu 141 to 87 BCE, represents the zenith of the Western Han Dynasty in both territorial expansion and bureaucratic sophistication. Building on the institutional frameworks established by his predecessors, Wu implemented comprehensive reforms designed to strengthen central authority, integrate diverse regions, and consolidate imperial ideology. The emperor's initiatives encompassed administrative restructuring, legal codification, ideological promotion, and economic control, reflecting a deliberate strategy to transform the Han state into a fully centralized imperial system. Centralization under Emperor Wu extended to bureaucratic organization. The emperor expanded the civil service, increasing the number of centrally appointed officials across commanderies and prefectures. Roles were clarified, responsibilities codified, and hierarchical lines of authority reinforced. Textual sources such as the Hanshu detail the reassignment of administrators to frontier regions, the rotation of personnel to prevent local entrenchment, and the establishment of performance-based oversight, demonstrating the dynasty's commitment to disciplined governance. Legal and administrative reforms under Wu emphasized uniformity and accountability. Standardized statutes and codified regulations ensured consistent enforcement across the empire, reducing regional variation inherited from earlier feudal compromises. Legal texts from the period indicate adjustments to civil, fiscal, and criminal law, reflecting both Confucian moral principles and the pragmatic demands of governance. Enforcement mechanisms relied on local magistrates, reporting systems, and periodic inspection tours, creating a network capable of maintaining central oversight even in distant regions. Ideological consolidation complemented administrative reform. Emperor Wu promoted Confucianism as the official state ideology, formalizing its presence in education, court ritual, and governance. Confucian scholars advised on policy, interpreted law through ethical principles, and contributed to the moral framing of imperial authority. Texts from this period, including discourses recorded in the Hanshu, emphasized the emperor's role as mediator between heaven and earth, linking moral legitimacy with bureaucratic function. This fusion of ideology and administration reinforced both the symbolic and practical reach of imperial power. Economic policies were integrated with bureaucratic and ideological reform. State monopolies over salt, iron, and coinage provided revenue for military campaigns and public works. Taxation was administered systematically, relying on population registers and land surveys to ensure equitable collection and accurate record-keeping. Government-controlled granaries and pricing regulations stabilized food supplies, while infrastructure projects, including roads, canals, and frontier garrisons, facilitated both commerce and military logistics. These measures underscore the interdependence of fiscal management, central authority, and strategic planning. Military oversight was also linked to administrative reform. Emperor Wu institutionalized frontier defense through permanent garrisons, conscription systems, and the integration of military colonies into local governance structures. Generals and administrators coordinated closely, ensuring that resources, intelligence, and troop movements were systematically managed. Campaigns against the Xiongnu and southern territories illustrate how reform extended the empire's operational reach, demonstrating that centralization was as much an organizational achievement as a territorial one. Emperor Wu's reforms reflect interpretive insights into statecraft. First, the integration of bureaucracy and ideology illustrates the dynasty's capacity to translate ethical principles into practical governance. Second, the expansion of fiscal and administrative networks demonstrates that central authority required sophisticated record-keeping, oversight, and logistical coordination. Third, the coordination of military, economic, and civil structures reveals a systemic approach to empire, where reforms in one domain reinforce stability and effectiveness in others. Archaeological and textual evidence from this period supports these observations. Administrative documents, inscriptions, and imperial edicts indicate the distribution of officials, the oversight of tax collection, and the implementation of standardized practices. Frontier fortifications, canals, and roads attest to the physical infrastructure required to sustain a centralized state across vast distances. Collectively, these records illustrate the breadth and depth of Emperor Wu's reforms, emphasizing their enduring influence on subsequent Han governance. By the conclusion of Emperor Wu's reign, the Han Dynasty had achieved unprecedented centralization. Imperial authority penetrated both core and frontier regions, integrating administration, law, ideology, and economic management into a cohesive system. Power reached its apex through reform, demonstrating that imperial strength derived not solely from military conquest but from the systematic consolidation of governance structures, institutional oversight, and ideological coherence. The expansive policies and military campaigns of Emperor Wu generated unprecedented fiscal demands on the Han state. While centralization and reform strengthened imperial authority, they required extensive funding for garrisons, roads, canals, frontier settlements, and campaigns against the Xiongnu and southern polities. To meet these obligations, the state relied on monopolies over essential commodities, heavy taxation, and corvée labor. Textual records, including the Han Shu and the discourses on salt and iron 81 BCE, document the growing economic pressures and the debates surrounding their administration. State monopolies over salt, iron, and coinage were central to revenue generation. Salt and iron were produced in government-operated facilities, often located near mineral deposits or established foundries. Centralized production allowed the court to control prices and collect profits for military and infrastructural projects. Coinage regulation ensured uniform currency for taxation and trade, facilitating both administrative efficiency and market stability. While these measures increased revenue, they also disrupted local economies and limited merchant autonomy, generating tensions between state control and private enterprise. Peasant households bore a disproportionate share of economic burden. Taxes were collected through grain levies, poll taxes, and corvée labor obligations, often imposed in combination. Field records and imperial edicts indicate that surplus extraction varied by region, depending on soil productivity and proximity to the capital or frontier. The intensification of taxation coincided with inflationary pressures, as increased demand for military provisioning and construction materials drove up the cost of grain, livestock, and tools. These factors contributed to growing social strain among rural populations, particularly smallholders vulnerable to land accumulation by elite families. Over time, wealth inequality intensified. Large landowners, often holding estates adjacent to frontier garrisons or near profitable resource zones, expanded their holdings by acquiring small peasant plots or leveraging tax exemptions. Archaeological surveys in Hunan, Shandong, and the southern Yangtze region reveal estate consolidation, while tomb inscriptions and family registers illustrate the social stratification of rural communities. The combination of elite land accumulation and peasant taxation created structural vulnerabilities that would periodically erupt into localized unrest. Economic stress also affected labor mobilization. Corvée labor supported the construction of roads, canals, and fortifications, as well as mining operations for salt and iron. Archaeological evidence, including large-scale irrigation projects and remnants of foundries, demonstrates the scale of these state enterprises. Although essential to imperial objectives, labor conscription imposed constraints on agricultural productivity, as able-bodied men were periodically withdrawn from fields, further amplifying peasant hardship and dependence on larger landholding families. The social consequences extended to frontier populations as well. Han colonists and garrison troops required provisioning, settlements, and administrative support. Local resources were taxed to supply these communities, creating pressures on indigenous populations and settlers alike. Reports from frontier commanderies describe occasional tensions and revolt, indicating that the integration of peripheral territories into the imperial economy could provoke resistance if burdens became excessive. Fiscal strain prompted internal debates among scholars and officials. Confucian critics argued that excessive monopolies and taxation violated moral governance principles, advocating relief for peasants and moderation in state intervention. Legalist administrators emphasized the necessity of resource extraction to maintain military readiness and infrastructure. The discourses on salt and iron records these arguments, revealing the tension between ideology and pragmatic governance. The debates themselves illustrate the Han administration's awareness of social costs and the competing priorities inherent in maintaining a large empire. Despite these pressures, the Han state maintained relative stability during Emperor Wu's reign, demonstrating the effectiveness of bureaucratic oversight and administrative coordination. Revenue collection, state monopolies, and conscripted labor were managed through centralized registers, census data, and local magistrates, ensuring that fiscal obligations were enforced systematically. Archaeological evidence of storage granaries, roads, and canals confirms the logistical capacity to mobilize resources across the empire, linking economic policy to state control and territorial integration. The cumulative impact of fiscal policies highlights the interdependence of economic strength, social stability, and imperial ambition. Expansion carried economic weight, and the costs of maintaining military readiness, infrastructural development, and frontier integration were borne largely by peasant households and regional administrators. These strains shaped governance priorities, necessitating careful balancing between resource extraction, social cohesion, and administrative oversight. Imperial authority depended not only on policy formulation but on the sustained capacity to implement and enforce economic obligations throughout a diverse and geographically expansive realm. By the end of Emperor Wu's reign, the Han Dynasty had achieved unprecedented territorial and bureaucratic consolidation, yet at the cost of increasing social and fiscal pressure. Inflation, monopolistic control, and labor demands produced structural inequalities that would reverberate through the late Western Han period. These conditions set the stage for subsequent administrative adjustments, highlighting the complex relationship between military ambition, economic management, and societal resilience within one of China's most influential imperial administrations. The death of Emperor Wu in 87 BCE marked a turning point in the Han Dynasty, prompting a period of political retrenchment and reorganization. Wu's successors faced the challenge of managing an empire that had expanded to unprecedented geographic and administrative scope, while coping with the fiscal pressures accumulated during his campaigns. Succession planning and court appointments became central to maintaining continuity in governance and avoiding destabilization. Emperor Zhao, r. 87 to 74 BCE, a minor at the time of Wu's death, assumed the throne under the guidance of regents and senior ministers. Key court figures, including Hua Guang, Shang Guanjie, and Jin Midi, exercised substantial authority, controlling appointments, policy implementation, and imperial communications. This regency system created a temporary redistribution of power within the palace, balancing the young emperor's authority with experienced bureaucratic oversight. Records from the Han Shu indicate that this arrangement allowed administrative continuity while establishing protocols for imperial intervention. The transition also involved recalibration of economic and military policies. Wu's extensive military campaigns and state monopolies had generated both revenue and social tension. Successive administrators moderated some policies, reducing corvée labor demands and relaxing certain monopolistic practices. Grain levies and taxation on smallholders were reassessed to alleviate peasant burdens while maintaining revenue for frontier garrisons and central administration. These adjustments were documented in official edicts and regional reports, reflecting pragmatic management of empire-wide obligations. Court politics played a decisive role in shaping policy during this period. The influence of regents, senior ministers, and imperial relatives affected appointments to commanderies, military commands, and administrative offices. Conflicts among powerful families and court factions occasionally disrupted local governance. Inscriptions and memorials highlight instances of reassignment, removal, or promotion of officials to maintain loyalty and enforce policy uniformity. These adjustments demonstrate the centrality of bureaucratic coordination in sustaining imperial stability. Succession also necessitated attention to the ideological foundations of rule. Confucian scholars continued to advise the court on ceremonial practice, legal administration, and ethical governance. Rituals marking imperial transitions were conducted at the ancestral temples and key ceremonial sites, including the Temple of Heaven. Astronomical observations and divination records guided decisions regarding auspicious dates for enthronement, administrative reforms, and military actions. These practices reinforced the legitimacy of the new emperor while signaling continuity of imperial ideology. The management of frontier relations remained a priority during this period. Commanderies along the northern and western borders continued to require coordination for garrison supply, local governance, and diplomacy with neighboring polities. Reports indicate that officials monitored trade routes, military deployments, and regional tax collection, ensuring that adjustments in central policy were implemented effectively at the periphery. The maintenance of these systems was essential to sustaining Han authority across diverse and geographically dispersed territories. Administrative reforms also included reassessment of personnel structures. Officials appointed under Emperor Wu were evaluated for performance, loyalty, and adherence to law. Transfers and promotions were recorded in the Hanshu and in local archives, reflecting structured oversight. Training and education in Confucian classics were emphasized for new appointees, particularly for roles in civil administration and law, ensuring a consistent bureaucratic culture across the empire. By the end of this period, the Han court had implemented a series of adjustments designed to maintain stability following Emperor Wu's ambitious expansions. Policies moderated taxation and labor demands, while bureaucratic oversight and ceremonial practice reinforced imperial authority. Succession arrangements, regency oversight, and court coordination ensured continuity of governance, even as the challenges of administering a vast and diverse empire persisted. The combination of administrative redistribution, economic recalibration, and ideological continuity allowed the Han Dynasty to stabilize the state temporarily. However, structural vulnerabilities, including reliance on regents, court factionalism, and fiscal pressures, remained present within the political system. These factors would influence subsequent imperial decision-making and contribute to the challenges faced by later rulers in the Western Han period. The death of Emperor Ai and the succession of young heirs in the early 1st century CE created a power vacuum within the Western Han court. Wang Mang, a high-ranking official and member of the imperial clan, gradually consolidated authority, ultimately declaring himself emperor in 9 CE and founding the Xiongnu dynasty. His rise represented both a continuation of Confucian reformist ideals and an unprecedented challenge to established Han institutional frameworks. Wang Mang's administration was marked by ambitious reforms aimed at addressing social inequality and restructuring the economy. Central to his program was land nationalization, designed to redistribute large estates and promote smallholder cultivation. Historical sources, including the Hanshu and Xiongnu, record the division of private estates into state-managed holdings, with allocations to peasants intended to reduce concentration of wealth and restore equitable access to arable land. Although these policies reflected Confucian and legalist principles, implementation proved inconsistent, particularly in remote provinces where local elites resisted redistribution. Currency reform was another hallmark of Wang Mang's regime. He introduced new coinage types, including knife and spade money, and attempted to regulate monetary circulation to stabilize inflation. Archaeological evidence confirms the production and circulation of these coins, but contemporary records indicate that shortages, counterfeiting, and public confusion undermined the effectiveness of these measures. The disruption of commercial networks, coupled with the persistence of monopolistic practices in essential goods, generated economic instability throughout the empire. Wang Mang also sought to reorganize taxation, labor obligations, and administrative appointments. State granaries and corvée labor systems were restructured to align with new principles of equitable distribution. Reforms extended to military recruitment and frontier management, with the intention of linking economic regulation to defense. However, the scale of these reforms, combined with insufficient bureaucratic capacity, created gaps in enforcement, particularly in distant commanderies where local elites retained influence and customary practices. Political opposition and social unrest compounded administrative challenges. Peasant revolts erupted in multiple provinces, reflecting dissatisfaction with forced compliance, economic disruption, and the uneven application of land redistribution. Notably, the Red Eyebrows Rebellion in Shandong and the Lulin Uprising in the south demonstrated that support for Wang Mang's ideological program was limited outside central authority. Imperial records indicate that these revolts were coordinated, well-armed, and strategically organized, suggesting both widespread grievance and local administrative weakness. Wang Mang's attempts to restore classical institutions, including ritual, bureaucracy, and moral governance, faced inherent contradictions. While reforms were ideologically justified, The disruption of pre-existing Han administrative structures undermined their practical implementation. Edicts and memorials from the period reveal tensions between central mandates and provincial compliance, highlighting the difficulty of imposing sweeping systemic change without established institutional foundations. Economic and political structures that had sustained the Western Han were temporarily weakened, reducing imperial capacity to enforce authority. The Xiongnu dynasty's military campaigns, both defensive and expansionist, further strained resources. Wang Meng's forces were deployed to suppress rebellions, secure frontier commanderies, and enforce land and tax reforms. Archaeological evidence of fortifications, granaries, and supply depots illustrates the logistical effort required, yet contemporary accounts note high casualty rates, desertions, and local resistance. These operational difficulties compounded social unrest and weakened popular confidence in the central regime. By 23 CE, the combination of economic instability, administrative disruption, and widespread revolt led to the collapse of Wang Meng's rule. Rebel forces captured the capital, and Wang Meng was killed, ending the Xiongnu interregnum. The disintegration of centralized authority underscored the limits of ideology and reform in the absence of functional administrative and fiscal structures. While his policies were ambitious in scale and principle, their failure demonstrated the centrality of institutional continuity to the governance of a large empire. Following Wang Meng's demise, Han loyalists restored the imperial lineage, inaugurating the Eastern Han period under Emperor Guangwu. The restoration involved the re-establishment of commandery structures, land tenure norms, and bureaucratic oversight disrupted during the interregnum. The early Eastern Han rulers faced the dual challenge of rebuilding administrative capacity and consolidating frontier defenses while addressing the social and economic consequences of prolonged upheaval. The Xiongnu interregnum thus represents a critical episode in Han history, illustrating the interaction of reformist ideology, administrative capacity, and social dynamics. Ideology alone could not replace institutions, and the collapse of Wang Meng's regime highlighted the dependence of imperial authority on both effective bureaucracy and popular compliance. The lessons of this period informed subsequent policies in the Eastern Han, shaping approaches to succession, land management, and frontier administration. Following the collapse of Wang Meng's Xiongnu dynasty in 23 CE, the Eastern Han period began under the leadership of Emperor Guangwu, r. 25 to 57 CE. Guangwu's restoration aimed to re-establish imperial authority, rebuild bureaucratic institutions, and stabilize economic and military structures disrupted during the interregnum. Administrative continuity, adherence to previous Han legal codes, and pragmatic reallocation of resources were central to this process. Commanderies and local magistrates were reinstated, land tenure systems returned to pre-Xiongnu norms, and census operations resumed to facilitate taxation and labor obligations. Despite these successes, court politics quickly emerged as a source of tension. The Eastern Han restoration relied on both imperial family members and high-ranking officials, whose interests often conflicted. Factional divisions formed between scholar officials advocating Confucian governance and palace factions seeking proximity to the emperor. Textual evidence from the Ho Han Shu records frequent disputes over appointments, ceremonial precedents, and policy decisions, illustrating the fragility of centralized authority even in the immediate post-restoration period. A distinctive feature of Eastern Han court politics was the increasing influence of eunuchs. Originally serving administrative and ceremonial functions, eunuchs gradually accumulated control over access to the emperor, appointment recommendations, and the management of palace finances. By the mid-1st century CE, eunuchs played a decisive role in selecting officials and mediating factional disputes. Memorials and court records indicate that their authority extended beyond the palace, influencing provincial governance and judicial outcomes, which created friction with traditional bureaucratic elites. Factionalism was further exacerbated by the need to balance regional power. Military generals, local magistrates, and frontier administrators retained substantial autonomy due to geographic and logistical constraints. The court's efforts to supervise appointments and ensure loyalty occasionally led to conflicts, with factions aligning along family networks, regional origins, and policy preferences. Epigraphic evidence from tomb inscriptions and memorial stelae demonstrates the prevalence of factional patronage in official appointments and the influence of kinship ties on administrative decision-making. Economic considerations also influenced court dynamics. The restoration of state monopolies over salt and iron, along with taxation of land and labor, was essential to funding frontier garrisons and maintaining public works. Officials and palace factions debated the balance between revenue extraction and social stability, creating recurring tensions. Reports to the emperor, memorials, and regional correspondence indicate that disagreements over fiscal policy often aligned with factional divisions, intertwining economic management with political competition. Succession planning remained a central concern within the court. Eastern Han emperors frequently relied on regents, empresses, and influential eunuchs to guide youthful or inexperienced rulers. This reliance magnified the influence of court factions and complicated decision-making. Historical records document multiple instances of disputes over imperial succession, with factions mobilizing to protect their interests or secure the elevation of preferred heirs. These disputes occasionally resulted in purges, forced retirements, or demotions of officials, demonstrating the volatility of palace politics. The Eastern Han court also maintained vigilance over external threats while managing internal competition. Frontier commanderies continued to require military oversight, logistical coordination, and tribute collection. The coordination of these distant territories relied on trust in appointed officials and the capacity of palace factions to enforce directives. Archaeological evidence, including garrison fortifications, canal networks, and granaries, attests to the administrative structures supporting this oversight. Despite these measures, the combination of factionalism, eunuch influence, and regional autonomy limited the central government's capacity to fully control distant commanderies. Religious and ceremonial authority reinforced imperial legitimacy amid political fragmentation. Court rituals, ancestral observances, and divination practices were maintained to assert continuity of the emperor's cosmic mandate. Astronomical records, sacrificial protocols, and court diaries illustrate the role of ritual in mediating factional disputes and legitimizing policy decisions. By codifying ceremonial practices and ritual hierarchy, the court sought to stabilize authority while internal power structures remained contested. By the mid-1st century CE, the Eastern Han Restoration had achieved administrative and territorial stabilization, but court politics continued to challenge governance. Power fractured at the center, with eunuchs, scholarly officials, and imperial relatives each asserting influence over appointments, policy, and succession. These internal divisions coexisted with efforts to maintain economic stability, frontier security, and bureaucratic oversight, highlighting the persistent complexity of managing a restored but expansive empire. The interaction between court factions and regional administrators set the stage for recurring social and political unrest. Challenges to imperial authority arose from both elite competition and pressures on local populations, whose labor, taxation, and compliance were essential to maintaining centralized control. The structural tensions established during this period would continue to influence governance throughout the Eastern Han, shaping the empire's ability to respond to crises and contributing to the long-term trajectory of decline. By the late 2nd century CE, the Eastern Han Dynasty faced significant structural strain. Widespread economic inequality, corruption within the central court, and the ongoing influence of eunuchs had eroded state authority. In 184 CE, these pressures culminated in the outbreak of the Yellow Turban Rebellion, a widespread peasant uprising inspired by the Taoist teachings of Xiongnu and his followers. The movement drew support from rural communities in Hebei, Shandong, and surrounding provinces, leveraging social discontent, high taxation, and localized grievances against landlords and officials. The rebellion was characterized by both ideological and military organization. Xiongnu established a network of regional commanders and promoted the Way of Supreme Peace, Taiping Dao, combining spiritual rhetoric with mobilization of tens of thousands of peasants. Historical texts, including the Ho Han Shu, describe mass demonstrations, coordinated assaults on local commanderies, and attempts to seize granaries and administrative centers. While often poorly armed compared with imperial forces, rebels exploited local knowledge, mobility, and widespread dissatisfaction to challenge the state's presence in multiple regions simultaneously. The Han military response revealed both administrative capability and systemic weakness. Regional armies and imperial contingents were mobilized to suppress uprisings, relying on conscripted troops, local militias, and the commandery-based garrison system. Commanders such as He Jin and Lu Ji coordinated campaigns across provinces, deploying troops to strategic locations while maintaining supply lines and communication networks. Archaeological evidence of fortifications, weaponry, and road networks confirms the logistical infrastructure supporting these counterinsurgency operations. Nonetheless, the scale and simultaneity of the rebellion strained the capacity of the Han military and exposed vulnerabilities in regional command structures. The rebellion prompted the central court to delegate greater authority to local elites and military leaders. Provincial officials, previously constrained by centralized oversight, were granted increased autonomy to recruit troops, levy funds, and enforce order. This delegation accelerated the emergence of regional power bases, as successful commanders consolidated personal loyalty from troops and local populations. Memorials and official correspondence record the coordination of military campaigns under provincial oversight, highlighting the decentralized implementation of imperial authority in response to existential threats. Economic disruption compounded the rebellion's effects. Agricultural production declined in affected provinces due to displacement, destruction of property, and diversion of labor to military service. Grain shortages and rising prices were recorded in official reports, while local taxation collection became inconsistent. State granaries and transport networks attempted to mitigate shortages, but the combination of widespread revolt and administrative overextension limited effectiveness. These pressures illustrated the interconnectedness of military, economic, and administrative systems in sustaining imperial control. The suppression of the Yellow Turban Rebellion required extensive mobilization over several years. By the late 180 CE, the uprising had largely been quelled through coordinated campaigns combining imperial, provincial, and militia forces. Zhang Ju and his immediate followers were executed, and many rebel cells were disbanded. However, residual insurgencies persisted, particularly in southern provinces, reflecting underlying social and economic grievances that had not been addressed by military suppression alone. These lingering disturbances continued to challenge local governance and resource allocation. The rebellion also facilitated the rise of regional warlords. Generals who distinguished themselves in the suppression campaigns retained armed followings, established territorial control, and exercised independent authority over taxation and recruitment. Figures such as Cao Cao, Sun Jian, and Liu Bei emerged from this period, consolidating power in former imperial commanderies. Historical records indicate that these warlords operated with a degree of autonomy, negotiating with both imperial authorities and local elites to maintain control. The central government's reliance on such figures marked a significant shift in the balance between imperial authority and regional militarized power. Institutional responses to the rebellion reflected both continuity and adaptation. The court maintained the conscription system, restructured frontier garrisons, and reinforced the appointment of loyal officials in strategic provinces. Memorials and administrative edicts document efforts to stabilize revenue collection, repair infrastructure, and restore order in disrupted regions. At the same time, the necessity of relying on semi-independent military leaders signaled a structural change. The state could no longer exercise exclusive control over armed force, and authority increasingly depended on negotiated loyalty and local initiative. By the end of the 180 CE, the Yellow Turban Rebellion had been militarily suppressed, but the consequences for the Han Dynasty were enduring. The state lost its monopoly on force, regional militarization intensified, and the foundation of central authority weakened. The combination of economic strain, social unrest, and empowered military elites established conditions that would make the Eastern Han increasingly vulnerable to internal fragmentation. The period following the rebellion marked the irreversible erosion of centralized governance and the rise of localized, militarized power structures, setting the stage for the eventual disintegration of imperial control and the onset of the Three Kingdoms era. By the early 3rd century CE, the Eastern Han Dynasty confronted an irreversibly weakened political system. Decades of factionalism, eunuch influence, peasant uprisings, and militarization had eroded central authority. In 220 CE, Emperor Xian formally abdicated in favor of Cao Pai, the son of the prominent general and de facto ruler Cao Cao, ending over 4 centuries of Han imperial governance. This abdication marked the formal transition to the Three Kingdoms period, wherein the territories of Wei, Shu, and Wu emerged as competing states across former Han domains. The dissolution of centralized power was both administrative and territorial. Commanderies that had once adhered to imperial decrees were increasingly governed by military governors with autonomous authority over taxation, troop recruitment, and local administration. Records in the Sangguozi and Ho Hanshu indicate that many regions maintained bureaucratic structures inherited from Han law and Confucian governance but exercised these functions independently. Local magistrates, scholars, and military leaders assumed roles that blurred civil and martial authority, reflecting the adaptive reuse of imperial institutions in fragmented polities. Military control dictated political authority during this transition. Warlords, including Cao Cao in the north, Liu Bei in the west, and Sun Quan in the south, consolidated power through garrisoned armies, fortified administrative centers, and strategic alliances. These leaders leveraged pre-existing Han bureaucratic frameworks, census data, and granary systems to support their domains. Archaeological evidence, such as fortifications in Hunan, Hubei, and Jiangsu, along with military correspondences and administrative records, demonstrates how Han infrastructure continued to underpin the nascent kingdom's governance despite the absence of a single central ruler. Economic continuity was maintained even amid political division. Han taxation methods, state granaries, and road networks persisted within regional administrations, facilitating trade, resource allocation, and supply for military operations. Merchants and local producers operated within these structures, often adapting to the priorities of regional authorities. Coinage, weights, and measures standardized under the Han remained in circulation, supporting market transactions and fiscal reporting across the successor states. These continuities illustrate how administrative and economic systems outlasted dynastic authority. Cultural and ideological inheritance persisted as well. Confucian scholars and administrators continued to advise rulers, shaping legal codes, ceremonial practices, and moral rhetoric. Temples, ancestral shrines, and educational institutions built during the Han period remained operational, preserving ritual continuity. Texts such as the Confucian classics, legal codes, and historical annals were maintained, copied, and referenced by officials in Wei, Shu, and Wu, demonstrating the enduring influence of Han intellectual and bureaucratic culture on successor polities. The fragmentation process also highlighted the adaptive capacity of Han institutions. Regional rulers relied on established commandery hierarchies, census practices, and legal frameworks to maintain order and mobilize resources. While the monopoly of the emperor was no longer present, these structures allowed for continuity in taxation, administration, and military logistics. In effect, Han institutional legacies provided the scaffolding for governance, even as political unity dissolved. Social hierarchies and land tenure systems established under Han rule persisted in modified forms. Elite families retained control over estates, while peasant households continued to function as basic fiscal and labor units. Tombs, inscriptions, and household registers from the early Three Kingdoms period confirm the continuation of familial and social structures, demonstrating the long-term endurance of Han norms in the absence of central authority. The transition to the Three Kingdoms did not erase the achievements of the Han Dynasty. Roads, canals, fortifications, legal codes, administrative manuals, and bureaucratic offices remained in operation, providing the structural foundation upon which successor regimes built their authority. Records and archaeological evidence indicate that while power was now contested, the organizational and cultural frameworks of the Han Dynasty continued to inform governance, taxation, military strategy, and ritual practice. By the end of this period, political unity had dissolved, yet the material, institutional, and cultural legacies of the Han endured across divided territories. Former commanderies, scholarly traditions, bureaucratic structures, and economic systems served as the basis for administration in the Wei, Shu, and Wu kingdoms. Unity had been lost, But the enduring influence of Han governance, law, and culture persisted, providing a template for subsequent dynasties and shaping the trajectory of Chinese history long after the collapse of imperial authority. If you found this exploration of the Han Dynasty insightful, subscribe to Nightfall History to follow our journey through the rise and fall of civilizations. Click the bell icon to receive notifications for daily historical documentaries. And leave a comment sharing which part of Han history fascinated you most.